Good evening. I am Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board. This is the regular meeting of the Select Board for Tuesday, June 2nd, 2020. This meeting, as all meetings during this COVID-19 health emergency, is being held remotely. We're using the WebEx events platform, and the meeting is being recorded. A quorum of the Select Board is participating from their respective remote locations. Let me start off with announcements, updates, or comments from the Select Board members. And I'd like to start with a personal statement regarding our current situation in the United States of America. Other Select Board members may also offer their thoughts. I encourage them to do so. This past week has been frightening and ominous. 100,000 deaths from the deadly virus, many of which were avoidable. The brutal and depraved murder of an unarmed Black man in Minneapolis, caught on video for all the world to see. Rage that transcends race at the murder and the underlying conditions besetting communities of color. And recognition that those conditions are really a reflection of the failure of our economic system across the board and for most people. A treasonous, that's my word, and I use that advisedly. I'm using it in the constitutional sense. Levying a war against America by the President of the United States, sending in active duty military forces to terrorize American citizens in the nation's capital. And finally, the use of white nationalist provocateurs to undermine the legitimate rage of demonstrators, which is being reported in the media by their violence and egged on by the president and, in my view, likely including foreign parties who we know have intervened using hybrid warfare to create chaos and confusion, including in the 2016 presidential election. In my opinion, it is now time to be afraid for America. As Boston's own Malcolm X once said, the chickens have come home to roost, not just because of the rage resulting from the death of George Floyd, but because of the problems of law enforcement in many parts of the country and the economic and social systems that continue to fester like a cancer. As a Black man with some ability to make changes in this town's law enforcement and town government in general, I'm always looking to make sure that Brookline does not fit into the patterns that we are seeing in some parts of the country. With respect to law enforcement, I urge people to carefully read the statement of Chief Andrew Lipson, which gives me comfort that Brookline is on the right path. That right path was put forward under the presidency of Barack Obama. During his presidency, we had instances of police violence throughout the country, but we had a commitment at the top to intervene against it. Obama's 21st century policing guidelines that informs Brookline's police and his Justice Department's willingness to intervene with police departments who are not living up to the expectations we have of proper police work with consent decrees were reforms that were critically important to minimize the problems that we're seeing today and that have been cast aside by the current occupant of the White House. Police departments like Brookline's and other law enforcement agencies that are committed to policing with integrity have continued with those reforms. Reforms don't assure us that there will be no problems, but they provide a framework within which problems can be addressed. In my view, the words of George Floyd's brother Terrence Floyd yesterday are very important, now more so than ever. He said, let's stop thinking that our voice don't matter and vote. While we consider those issues facing our country today, let us not forget that we are in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic. As we are out demonstrating and shouting and expressing our justified anger, remember to keep your mask and eyes covered in place and eye coverings in place. You can talk through your mask and still be heard. Take that small safety precaution. And if you're out in a demonstration, quarantine yourself or at least stay away from health vulnerable people. Those are my thoughts. As I said, they're my personal views, given the current very unusual and difficult situation that we face in this country. I offer opportunity to other select board members to express their views, their concerns, their suggestions. Who would like to speak?
I'm happy to share something.
Pardon me?
I'm happy to share something.
Hernandez.
Yeah. Okay, so, I really thought about this, over the course of the weekend, and I talked to Bernard, I think, a couple of times over this weekend about the events that were going on. And I thought about saying something today, and then I thought about writing something that I would say today, and then I ended up just writing a fully fledged post that's out there right now. And I'll read from some of that, and then I wanted to share some additional thoughts beyond that. But it's important for me to let you know that for me personally, the last few days have been really tough. It's been tough to watch pain and frustration turn into violence and destruction in cities across the country, including right here in Boston. And it's tough to know that is what people will choose to focus on rather than the root causes of this unrest, for which for centuries now has been state-sanctioned violence, brutality, and murder. Even I was marching in a peaceful protest on Friday night, I felt a sense of heaviness, a bit of deja vu set in. I've been here so many times before. We had been here so many times before. And I have to admit, I wondered whether our protesting would make any difference. I thought back to the protests after the riots of the brutal beating of Rodney King when I was just a kid, and also the protest I participated in after the murders of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Gardner and 12-year-old Tamir Rice and so many others. And there I was again this weekend marching for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. Deja vu all over again. I also thought about my own encounters with police, how as a teenager, police officers repeatedly put their hands on my body without my consent and with no legitimate cause, something that we now call stop and frisk. I also thought about the police officer who put a gun to my head when I posed no danger and had committed no crime. I was a college graduate then on the way to a wedding. What white people who are home watching all of this have to understand is that when police encounter civilians, some of us are automatically steps closer to death than others. There's a centuries-long reason for this, rooted in causes that are external to policing, as well as those that are intrinsic to policing. And that's what folks like Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nikole Hannah-Jones, Ibram X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, and so many others have been trying to get you to understand. I know some of you are on the path to enlightenment, and I appreciate everyone out there who's reading these good books and taking anti-racism courses and all that. Please keep doing that. But here's the thing. Our freedom, and I mean the freedom as people of color from so many manifestations of oppression like economic, educational, and health injustices, but also freedom from violence, particularly by the state, the freedom of Black and brown people cannot be dependent on your full and complete understanding of how we got here. What we need you to do as you continue your learning is to get behind the efforts of Black Lives Matter, the movement, and Campaign Zero, which seeks to end police brutality. If you care about us, then you have to trust that we have a plan and that plan requires your complicity. So what does that mean here in Brookline? First, I want to make note of a certain human tendency, and that's a tendency to think that something isn't a problem because you haven't encountered it or don't know anyone who has. While I agree that our police department is better than most, trust me when I say we still have much work to do. I've been meeting with our police chief even before being elected, and he's been a willing partner in efforts to improve policing in Brookline. I was also glad to see a statement denouncing what happened to George Floyd as murder, pure and simple. So I'm looking forward to his partnership and your involvement in moving forward a number of policies that will increase trust and transparency while lowering the odds that Brookline's residents of color will face disproportionate policing or physical or verbal abuse by our officers. First, we have to fix our broken police complaint review process. This has been on our docket for a while now. We need a non-police independent investigator to review complaints and make determinations that the elected select board can rely on. And we need a more professionalized approach to the biannual review and revision of that process, including actually interviewing those who have gone through the complaint process, something that has yet to be done in the years since the process was last approved. We're overdue for another hearing on this process, and when it's scheduled, I'm going to need you all to be there to push for these necessary reforms. We have to put body cams on every officer and dash cams in every car. This is about building trust and increasing transparency. It's a teaching tool that can be used to improve policing practices, and it's an accountability tool that can spot officers who are ignoring their training. There's a new police contract in the works, and I need you to let the select board know that this must be included in that contract. And so here's the point where I'm expected to tell you that the vast majority of officers are good. But this is not about good and bad officers. It's about what standards we hold all officers to. Just because I'm a good driver doesn't mean I could treat a red light like a stop sign. Even if there are clearly no cars or pedestrians or cyclists in view, I need to sit there and wait for that light to turn green before I can proceed forward. One of the effects of setting clear and high standards for driving makes reckless drivers, those who put others at risk, even more obvious. Likewise, setting clear and high standards for all police makes those who would disregard those standards even more easily identifiable. It sets them even further apart from those who are following the rules, and it makes it so those officers cannot hide among those who are policing in a manner that is approved by the community. We need higher standards for when an officer can stop someone, and especially when they can put their hands on someone. We also need higher standards for how officers talk to people of color. How many videos have we seen where someone is being brutalized by the police and is still calling them sir or officer while they're being brutalized? And how many have we seen where an officer refers to a young black man as bro or dude or worse than that? That has to end. Put simply, our officers and administration need to be held to the highest standards, and we need clear, community-centered accountability measures for what happens when officers fail to live up to those standards. We also need to rethink our entire relationship with police. We need to reduce the number of civil violations which require police enforcement and find other ways to address non-criminal misbehavior. We should employ police resources sparingly and only when there is no other reasonable alternative. If you agree, please let our select board and our chief know. Police should be our last line of defense to protect us from the worst versions of ourselves. They should never be the instigators or perpetrators of violence. We need a police force that's lean and limited, patient and understanding, thoughtful and compassionate. And there's a role for the community here. Brookline residents, police are not the solution to every problem you encounter. The assumptions that are made about you and me by police and our neighbors are different. And when they're called, that leads to very predictable, disparate treatment. For some of us, especially Black people, this is an existential threat. And that so many of us have been willing to gather in public in the thousands during the midst of this pandemic to bring your attention to this fact should show you how serious we are about this. I truly believe we have an opportunity to be a national leader right here in Brookline in our approach to community safety, but it will only happen if you get involved in the process. We don't need your platitudes right now. We need you to get involved in changing policy. You can change our bylaws through town meeting, and you can change our policy direction through the select board. However you choose to do it, get started and don't stop until the job is done. Black lives are counting on it. I also wanted to say that this morning I had the pleasure of being in company with other elected officials of color at the State House who presented policies at the local, state, county, and federal level that would stem this tide of police violence against people of color, particularly Black people, particularly unarmed Black people. I encourage you to seek out information that was put out this morning And, as I was sort of heading back, thinking, reflecting on that conversation, one of the things that struck me is all of these policies have been written for a very long time. We've come up with the solutions to these problems. What we need is the political will to enact them. So I hope that you'll get involved in this process, turn what you feel right now into action by getting involved in our politics right here in Brookline. Support officials that are about making these kinds of reforms, and get involved yourself through town meeting by speaking at the select board and in other ways on the various committees and commissions that we have that are addressing these issues. So thanks for giving me the time to share all that. Appreciate it, Chair. Thanks.
States?
I have a statement.
Ms. Hamilton, yeah.
I say the name George Floyd. I echo our police chief when he calls it murder. I view my role, it is to listen to others and to empathize and to try to understand. It is to educate myself. It is to diversify my network as much as possible. And I need to name racism when it happens in front of me. My role is not to make it about me, or to perpetuate violence, or to post once on social media in order to make myself feel better, or to make other people feel bad that they are not doing enough. So I will say the name again, George Floyd.
Thank you, Ms. Hamilton. Anyone else?
I would like to say a short something. I'm sure I won't have the eloquence of any of you, but I've been around a long time, probably longer than most of you, and I can remember hideous acts of violence in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. When will it end? We must, and the things we've been doing just aren't getting there. So I've thought a lot about this, and one segment of our society in where this kind of violence is continually crops up is in our police departments. And not for a minute do I think that all police officers are hideously racist or would perpetuate this kind of violence. But I do think that there are pockets of this kind of terrible thinking, racist and angry and unacceptable in some of our police departments. And I thought that over the weekend, I read a tweet by Chattanooga Police Chief David Roddy, who said, I'm going to turn to my other computer so I can read his quote. He said, he had a message, by the way, for fellow law enforcement officers. Turn in your badge if you don't have an issue with George Floyd's death. And that's correct. But we should empower our police chiefs across the country to root out racism among their officers and to make it very clear. They have very explicit training on the hideous and terrible effects of these pernicious actions, and to when they understand that there's some officers just have that racism ingrained in them, they must get rid of them. They must not be police officers anymore. We're not going to end this unless, at least in the police segment, unless we deal with that. And I believe that our police chief has, and Andy Lipson, as well as our former police chief, Dan O'Leary, were committed to this. And I think I hope they've done a very good job. And I hate to think that we would ever have this kind of situation. But it's got to end across the country. And we can't have a president who encourages, as Bernard called them, these sort of saboteurs, these white supremacist saboteurs. We must understand that this kind of behavior is absolutely, absolutely forbidden, and we must take very, very strong measures to stop it.
Thank you.
So let me, I've got some remarks I want to give as well, and I want to thank my colleagues for their eloquence and their thoughtfulness. I'll be brief, just because I think much of what I wanted to say has already been articulated. I'm angry and upset tonight, as I know so many of you in this meeting are, and so many of us across the country and in this community. George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor are the latest victims in a history of racially motivated killings in this country. We must all work to stop these killings and to fight against racism and inequality in all of its forms. Over the past several months, we've witnessed the historical impact of COVID-19 across Brookline, Massachusetts, and the country. The impact of being Black and brown, Black or brown in America, has on a person's life and opportunities has never been more clear than it has been made by COVID-19. Specifically, the economic, healthcare, and public safety disparities that some in this country have experienced and continue to experience because of the color of their skin has never been so clear. The virus has highlighted the disproportionate burden of illness and death upon racial and ethnic minority groups in the U.S. and the perilous working conditions that minorities experience every day, virus or not. Today, I unequivocally state that I'm opposed to all forms of racism and inequality and stand in solidarity for justice.
Updates? Was I unmuted when I said that, Devin? Any other comments or updates? Okay, Mr.
Chair, you're going to call on Mr. Nutting?
Yeah, I was just about to call him. Yes.
Can I give an update about the census?
Oh, sure.
Sorry if I sound like a broken record here, but we had a census meeting this week. It was a very good meeting. We've realized that the census statistics for Brookline are not very good. I'll be very, very blunt. They're not as good as the rest of the state. We are behind in percentages of self-response. And this is very concerning, especially when we look at what's happening with our budgets and the very, very difficult situation we're in. And we don't get very much federal funding compared to other communities, but we could get more. And we could get more if people fill out the census, because that's the basis of the federal funding that we do get. We get it across all kinds of programs and subjects. We get it in education. We get quite a bit of it is in education. We get it in affordable housing. We get it for seniors. We get it for the most vulnerable citizens in our society, in our community. We have grants through CBDG that are directly linked to the census. So please, I urge you, and let's be at least on a par or better than the response rate in the rest of the state. We can do it. We just have to apply ourselves. It takes very, very little time. If you want to respond online, you can go to 2020census.gov. You could also call 1-844-330-2020. Please do it today if you haven't done it already. Thank you.
Any other updates? Thank you, Ms. Heller. That's a very important update. Any other updates?
I guess this is possibly my last meeting as a select board member. And I just want to publicly say thank you to my colleagues on the board and to the town administrator and his staff, as well as all the department heads and employees of the town. It's been a privilege, a difficult job at times, never more difficult than it has been recently, but it's been an honor and a privilege, and thank you to everybody.
I'd like to thank you, Ben, for what you've contributed to this board over the years that you've been on it. we will miss you. And in fact, we're going to try to squeeze in another meeting so that we can take more advantage of your wisdom.
Thank you,
Okay.
Ben. It's really difficult to think about you not being here. You were here when I came onto the board. I've known your family, your parents and been involved with them in many activities in the town. And it really has been a pleasure to understand how much you've contributed and your willingness to really dig in to an issue and lead a group of people to a solution. So thank you.
Okay.
Can I just say really quickly, just as I'll say as the new guy, one of the things that people probably don't recognize, because we all as a board may disagree on issues, quite often, but is that we have a really like collegial working sort of relationship. And when I came on, I had a ton of questions about how so many things that you'd never think about actually work. And Ben has been one of those guys that's been willing to answer every one of those questions along with others, but has really helped me to understand some things that I quite frankly didn't understand when I first joined. So I just want to say thank you for that publicly, Ben. Appreciate you.
And if I may, I just want to tell a quick anecdote. So I first met Ben when I was running for town meeting at the MLK event. And I remember shaking his hand and saying, "Oh my God, you're like as old as I am and you're running for that position?" And it's sowed a seed. I could see myself one day running for this position, just because I saw somebody who was my age going for it. So I really appreciate that he went for it and that we've been able to serve together.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ben. So, Mr. Nutting, I understand that you would like to update the select board and the public on the planning for the upcoming election.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to thank the board for their earlier comments. A sad day. And your leadership during this COVID crisis, and especially the upcoming election. The board took several steps. You moved the election to June to give us time to prepare for a safe election, as well as see the peak of the virus slowly go down and give some people maybe some comfort to come out and vote. You relocated 4 precincts to protect those citizens in the brick-on housing buildings, as well as our firefighters on Hammond Street. You reduced the polling hours to help us attract poll workers. And most of all, you helped by advocating for mail-in ballots. We did send out a postcard to every household, and I'll give you some numbers shortly, but all those things show strong leadership on behalf of the board to ensure that people can access the most important part of our democracy, and that's to vote. I want to thank Linda and the entire clerk staff. Chris Tisbert has been an absolute incredible machine. He's been there every day through this whole COVID thing, keeping the place going and working relentlessly. Alicia Hill is a polling machine. She just churns it out day in and day out. And Shayna Penner, they've all put in long hours to make this work. We've also had some extra help and some volunteers that there's no way we would have been successful or will be successful without them. You know, Jane Trevolini from upstairs and Sue Ford from the select board's office, Hank Hirons from the police, Terry Gozer as a volunteer. Carol Cara has been in the office about a month straight volunteering. And Bonnie Bastine from Mutual Aid of Brookline, who's helped us recruit poll workers, and the League of Women Voters. So it's been a real team effort to get to this point. The other thing I'd like to point out is what it takes to make this election successful. The public works, the town and school facilities, the police, the fire, the Board of Health, the IT, purchasing, the mailroom, the sign making, the volunteers, etc. It does take a village to run an election, if you didn't realize that. So thanks to all of those people. And now for our update. Just to remind people that the polls will open at noon and they'll close at 8 o'clock on June 9th. Remind people that in Precinct 3 is now at Precinct 8 at the Coolidge Corner School. Precinct 7 and 10 are at the high school, which is Precinct 8, and Precinct 15 is now at the Baker School. All voters in those precincts that would change were mailed a card informing them of the changes, and we did post signs at the former precincts letting them know where the new ones will be for this election. All households received a card letting them know about the change in voting hours, and were reminded to fill out their census form, as previously stated. To date, I don't have today's numbers, but we've received over 4,500 early and absentee ballots. That's an astonishing amount. In 2016, your total turnout for a local election was just under 2,300. While the legal deadline to request a ballot is next Monday at noon, practically speaking, you need to do it ASAP. But because by the time we process this and get it mailed back to you, you might not have time to mail it in. We did, under the suggestion of a citizen, put out front a couple boxes where you can, secure boxes where you can leave your ballot if you don't have time to mail it in and you don't want to go to the polls. And those will be checked right up through 8 p.m. on election day. So if you think on Saturday, you think you want to mail it, maybe you should bring it to the town hall to make sure that your vote counts. We're still looking for poll workers and volunteers. Again, thanks to the mutual aid of Brookline and the League. But we've had to replace over half of our poll workers, over 60, because folks just can't come to the polls given the COVID issue. So it's a challenge. We have to get them up and trained really quickly, and we could use a few more. So if anybody knows anybody, please contact us ASAP. We want to ensure that the election is run correctly and that we have sufficient workers. On election day, there'll be 12 polling places, 16 precincts, but as you know, we consolidated them. We will have a police officer at every precinct as required by law, and an additional police officer at every building to assist citizens that are coming in the building to answer any questions. Everyone will need to wear a mask. They'll be offered gloves. They'll have to social distance. We will have lots of pens, so they might only get used once or twice during an election. They'll be cleaned in between. Poll workers will have masks, gloves, plexiglass shields in front of their desks, and will be offered face shields if they don't have glasses or they want one. So we're trying to make every poll worker as safe as possible. The same with voters, with social distancing marks, gloves, and masks. We're only going to allow voters into the polling area equal to the number of vacant polling booths. So if there's a line, it will have to be outside the polling area, not inside the polling area. We've Mike Kilgallen from DPW has been great. We personally visited every location and rearranged some of the polling areas so that people can come in one entrance and go out one exit. We've spaced the polling booths 6 feet apart at least, and arranged it to make it so it's safe for all those people coming, going, and working. The DPW and the facilities folks will be in on Thursday and Friday setting up all the polling locations, and the Board of Health has reviewed, Dr. Jett has reviewed this plan and will come and visit to make sure that they are all set up appropriately to protect the health and welfare of the Brookline citizens. So please come out to vote, and we should have an unofficial tally if all goes well between 9 and 10. But that's if we get enough poll workers and the machines, which are 20 years old, hold up. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nutting. Well, I appreciate the work that you've done. We only generally interact with the clerk, Mr. Ward, and Ms. Goldball. But you've told us about some of the other people who are in the clerk's office that maybe we don't know as well, and people who are helping out with this election. And for me, I give my thanks to the work that they're doing. We all really appreciate it. It's incredibly important, not just for this election, but in preparation for the November election, especially.
I'll just add that I really appreciate, I was one of those folks very skeptical about all these changes that we were making, including while I was voting for some of them. But honestly, Mr. Nutting, you and the team there have done such a great job in getting us to this point. I really appreciate also how well you've been working with residents in town. I was on an exchange where a resident asked about, hey, how about we put some of these ballot applications at our post offices in town? And he said, all right, let me get back to you. The same day you said it's already done. We did it. Thank you for the idea. You made it happen. The idea of the drop-offs as well. The Brookline Housing Authority wanted to get ballot applications there. You helped them make that happen. I couldn't be any happier with this. And then also the partnership with Mutual Aid Brookline, which I understand has helped get 92 of those poll workers, of those volunteer workers, or not actually paid, but still volunteer workers. Phenomenal partnerships going on, and your willingness to work with whomever at any point to help make this election work has been really great. I did try to actually sign up to be a poll worker. We checked with town council and the state ethics commission, and apparently select board members just can't be, even if we're not on the ballot, we just can't work at the polls. So sorry I couldn't help you out there, but I just want to say thank you to you and the entire team for making this work. And I'm excited for next week. And if there are any ways that don't involve being at the polls to help, I'm happy to do that.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's move on to public comments. Devin, I understand we have a number of people who do want to make comments.
Yes, so we have four people signed up for public comment tonight. The first is Joan Lanecourt. Joan, you've been promoted to a panelist, and if you feel comfortable, you can share your video and unmute yourself.
Okay. I wanted to comment and personally invite the select board and anybody else who's visiting to, I think, a fairly unique collaboration. And we've heard about partnerships, and I think this is a really promising partnership between three of the boards and commissions in Brookline: the Housing Advisory Board, the Commission for Diversity and Inclusion, and the Economic Development Advisory Board, along with about 20, almost 20 other organizations in Brookline, to put on a series of forums around housing affordability. And I think both with COVID and with what's been happening this week, the issue of housing affordability is just rising to the top of the list. It's a health issue. You can't stay healthy if you don't have a home. And the title of the forum is Changing the Conversation, Housing Affordability in the Age of COVID-19. And we put together, I think, an exciting panel, which is in and of itself a coalition of different constituencies in Brookline, all of which are interdependent and need to work together if we are going to make progress on housing affordability. And we've actually shifted the language from affordable housing to housing affordability because we wanted to encompass a broader range of affordability. Affordable housing has a sort of conjures to mind, public housing, low-income housing, but there's a missing middle. And so what we are going to be talking about and addressing at the forum is that broader range. And so we have, in addition to diversity and inclusion, we have Chris Dempsey from Transportation, Alden Rains from Economic Development, Werner Lowy on Climate Sustainability, Jenny Raitt on housing affordability. And we felt that those 5 constituencies all need to work together because no one of them, can push this forward. And so, and the moderator is going to be Frank Steinfeld from the Brookline Community Foundation. This is the first of 3 forums. The second one is going to be July 19th, and that will look at successes from other cities and towns across the country. And then the third one, we hope in September, we haven't picked a date yet, is going to look at those successes and the issue of all 5 constituencies continuing to work together, in order to do affordable housing. We also need to be concerned about climate sustainability, transportation. They all are interdependent. And so the third one, we want to come out with a strategy that all of the constituencies agree to working on, and move forward and really increase the number of affordable units at various levels. So I'm hoping that it's Sunday, June 14th at 1 to 3 p.m. and it's going to be on Zoom. And you can register. We have a website called buildingabetterbrookline.org. And so I invite all of you to register and tell everybody else to register. I really also want to comment on, sitting here and listening to each of the statements that the select board made. I think that, there's no question that the police are, an issue, a function in our society that needs to be changed. But I also think that there are some more fundamental policies and practices that have to be addressed right here in Brookline. I think it's wonderful to support and to talk about what has to happen everywhere in the nation, but I think we have to look right here in Brookline, and I know that the commission has sent a statement and some suggestions to the select board about what we think needs to happen right here. And I'm sorry we haven't heard back yet. I'm hoping that you will respond. But I think the issue of engagement, that if people are not at the table where decisions are made, then it's not going to work out well. I think we have to do everything that we can to figure out how to get the voices of the people of color in Brookline at the various tables where decisions on budgeting, decisions on all the different commissions and boards, on affordable housing are made. And I think that's one of the institutional systemic pieces of racism that we have to address. Thank you.
Thank you. And who's next, Evan?
Next person signed up for public comment is Eric Hyatt. Eric has been promoted to a panelist and can now enable video and audio.
All right, can you hear me okay, Devin?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everybody. Eric Hyatt, 1569 Beacon Street. It's been a really difficult week. And I was very moved by the article published yesterday by Select Board Member Fernandez called "A Challenge to My overwhelmingly white, relatively wealthy, and allegedly progressive community. That was a very, very brave and gutsy article, and I'm calling today with some specific requests to the select board as a result of Dr. Fernandez's article. First of all, I would humbly request that the select board find a way to get a non-police independent investigator for issues of police misbehavior or worse in Brookline. Second of all, a biannual review of the complaint process. It's my understanding that there is the potential for such a review, but that no such review has taken place. Third, I would like to request the select board hold a hearing on the above matters. Number 4 should be an obvious one, body cams and dash cams. These things are welcomed by police unions and are viewed as a very useful tool. And I really can't imagine them not being a part of our next contract between Brookline's town administration and our police union. So I look forward to the select board's advocacy and leadership on body cams and dash cams. And finally, well, Dr. Fernandez said it best. He said, rethink our entire relationship with police. That comes down to our community's expectations, the times that we choose to call the police, and the expectations that differ wildly depending on the color of one's skin of what's going to happen based on making such a call. That's a Brookline-specific problem, and a Brookline-specific solution can be put in place here. These are nationwide issues, but what Dr. Fernandez called attention to are things that we can do in Brookline, and specifically things the select board can do. So I'm asking all of you to please honor George Floyd and everyone, unfortunately, who falls into his category by rethinking our relationships, by putting into place sensible policies, by reviewing the complaint process, and by holding hearings. I think that that is what our select board can be expected to do to show leadership. Thank you.
Thank you. Evan, third person?
Next, we have Deborah Brown. You've now been promoted to a panelist. You can unmute yourself and share your video if you feel comfortable.
Such a asthma. So,
Hi, Deborah.
hi. I'm assuming, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. My asthma's on the fritz. And I realized the other day, I just decided that it's probably a bit of hay fever induced asthma and a bit of George Floyd grief induced asthma. And I'm going to pick up a little bit on what Raul talked about. And the fact that as we talk about hate and how people can help and racism, we don't have to go far. I think for the past 3 or 4 weeks, I've talked about vulnerable populations and the budget. And the person, other than Raul, the only other person that's picked up on that has been Mel. And Mel has basically been yelling in the hinterlands. And if you want to make a difference, and I'm saying this to the select board, and I'm saying this to people that really want to make a difference, Joan picked up on this, it's how you govern. You have to think about the things that you have control over. You have some control over the budget. Do something. You had control over issues of voting. And if Mr. Nutting and Raul Mutual Aid, and again, I'm going to throw Mel's name in there, hadn't stepped up, we would have had a royal mess. but they were the fixers. Gerald Alston. And you can say it's messy. It is messy. But again, it's a case of how we look at race. It's a case of how we look at race in Brookline and racism. And it breaks my heart. And maybe it's just choking me to think about what we are doing or what we aren't doing. And I implore you, much like we're talking about what's happening in the rest of the country, I'm asking us, no, I am. I'm asking you, Select Board, to think about what you're doing right now, what you're going to do tonight, what you're going to do next week, and for the rest of your term, for purposes of George Floyd or school, how you're going to vote on school budget and anything else, because you have a role in this as well, you know. So thank you.
Thank you. And we have a fourth person.
The next person is Mark Levy, who's been promoted to a panelist.
I'm sorry, who is it?
Mark Levy.
Oh, Mark Levy, okay. Mr. Levy.
Oh, how are you? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Hear me yet?
Yep.
Okay, great. I've been spending a lot of time, like everybody has, this last several days, being very disturbed by what's been happening across the country. Mostly because I'm old enough to remember the summer of '67 and the way that people at that time tried to label the problem a Negro problem, that it was something about the people who were rioting, that they were thugs, they were criminals, there were outside agitators at work. I think these are all very familiar sounds from this last week. And I'm also old enough to remember the Kerner report, which said that, no, that's not the problem. The problem is that we're two nations at that point, and we're unequal nations, black and white, and that we're growing more and more unequal. And that seems to be the message that has been lost for almost 50 years. Every so often, somebody will bring it up and deal with it as in some way, but we're still at the point where people are getting shot because of, in part, of the color of their skin. And that's because of a legacy of racism that infects every part of our lives. Black people are more, and people of color and immigrants are more likely to be poor because they're less likely to be well educated. They're less likely to live near where the jobs are. And they're less likely to have access to the transportation that gets them to where the jobs are. And they're more likely to go to prison because, not because they're necessarily more criminal than the other populations, but because the social justice system is not socially just. The criminal justice system is not just. It's not equitable for all races. It's not colorblind. And worse, it doesn't recognize how serious the problems of inequality that have been brewing for the last 400 years still remain. And this is really an American problem. It's not just black and white. As I say, it's all people of color, people of different gender identities are still stigmatized because the majority still don't recognize their own prejudice, their own bias. And that is, I think, is the first step. I think that's one of the first steps that Brookline has to take, is to recognize that we're not a pure town, that there is prejudice, that belongs in everybody's mind and everybody's heart. Stereotyping still goes on. I know I still stereotype people when I see them, though I try very hard not to let that color my judgment. I'm not always capable of doing that. So I think this is the problem. We live in a society where privileged white Americans don't recognize how deeply ingrained racism is and other forms of prejudice are in this country and in themselves and in their own way of viewing the world. And I think that's one of the places where this board can lead, is helping people see that racism, racist attitudes are built in. Stereotypes are built into everybody. It's nothing to be ashamed of. The only thing to be ashamed of is not recognizing them and trying to overcome them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Levy. Final comment is from Donnell O'Neill. Apparently he cannot get into the meeting, so I'm going to read the comment from Donnell O'Neill. I would like to ask a question about systemic racism and how body cams would be a nice first step to easing some tension. I want to ask, what's the plan on getting the police CBA, I believe that means collective bargaining agreement, done, and who will take the lead on getting the state to mandate body cams? I don't know if anyone wants to answer that. I can respond to Mr. O'Neill later. Any other comments from the public? Ms. Williams?
No one has indicated to me in the chat that they would like to make a public comment, but we do have 3 call-in users who we could unmute at this time, or we could save that for the public hearing. It's up to you.
Do you know what they're interested in speaking about?
When someone calls into the meeting, unless they
okay,
give me like advance notice, then I won't know if they have any interest in speaking. So.
Okay. You usually ask them. You want to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
All right, the first number that I'm going to unmute is a 617 number. If you'd like to offer public comment, you are unmuted.
Okay, apparently not.
The second call-in user is not showing me their full number, so I can't see it, but you're unmuted. 913. And then the last call-in user is a 781. And if you'd like to make public comment, you're now unmuted.
Okay, so it looks like we have a nationwide audience. Okay. Moving on to the miscellaneous section of our agenda. Question of approving the minutes of May 26, 2020. Any edits to those minutes? Okay, I move approval of the minutes of the Select Board for May 26, 2020. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Next, question of awarding and executing contract number PW 20-25, reconstruction of Winchester Street and intersection improvements at Naples and Gibbs with Charles Contracting Company, Inc. of Watertown in the amount of $958,300.75. Mr. Kleckner, or I guess that Mr. Pepper-Sturgeon is. Are you speaking on that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm getting a feedback on the audio. This item before you is for the reconstruction of Winchester Street and some intersection improvements at Naples and Gibbs We did receive two bidders. Both have worked for the town of Brookline before. The construction of Winchester Street is to reconstruct a section that was not done under Phase 1. As you recall, Phase 1 was reconstructed between Fuller Street and the town line back 2 years ago, I believe it was. This section is from Beacon Street to Fuller. We were waiting for the gas company to complete their gas main replacement work and service replacement work in that area so that we could complete Phase 2. This is in the vicinity of the senior center, as you know. The work involves full reconstruction of the street, the addition of two raised crosswalks. One of them is the replacement of the existing raised crosswalk at William Street. The second is a new one that's going to be located at Fuller Street. We have some new pavement markings that are going to be installed for bicycle accommodations, as well as the usual new signage that will go along with all of that. At the intersection of Naples and Gibbs, this work is for also new pavement, installation of curb extensions that are primarily used to decrease the crossing distance at crosswalks for pedestrians to make it a safer crosswalk. It will also include ADA improvements for the wheelchair ramps and other amenities, pavement markings for bike lanes, and for pedestrian access as well. Both of these projects were approved by the Transportation Board some time ago and are part of our planned work for fiscal 2020. The money is available now. And as I said, both contractors have done work for the town of Brookline in the past.
Okay, any questions from the board? This is coming out of our fiscal year 2020 budget. Mr. Kleckner, is there any reason why this would not be deferred or cut back to any extent? Or is this one of the projects that really is critical? I know around the senior center, we really need road repair, but.
Sure. No, I recommend it. I do believe that we should take a hard look at all projects. So even though this one, I guess that you wouldn't even get these projects if we didn't think they were probably worthwhile. So this one in particular, I support. You'll hear later on in the evening the way I'm looking at the capital budget going forward, and I believe at a minimum it should be used for the basics, roadway, transportation calming, traffic calming, and those and the like. And so Winchester Street is obviously a great candidate for that. We already did half of the street. I drive down it a lot. It's in terrible condition, the unpaved or the unimproved area. And so I think it's a great project and we recommend it highly.
Okay, any questions from the board?
Yes. First of all, as someone who lives on Winchester Street, I can testify to what the town administrator just said about the street. But I guess Commissioner, if you can just talk folks through. A lot of people see work that's done on their block, and then there's more work that happens, and it's not always us. It's National Grid and Eversource and these other companies. My understanding is that there's that when they dig, they're supposed to put the street back. I guess to the extent possible the way it was. But what a lot of folks around town see is once the digging's done and once the workers move on, the streets are pretty well tore up. So is it then our responsibility to do some repaving, or should we be holding maybe our the folks that are doing the digging from outside of Brookline to a higher standard? What am I missing?
We absolutely require contractors that dig up our roads to replace them, at least to the condition that they were prior to the construction. However, in certain cases, and in this Winchester Street falls under this case, if the street is already in the queue for our own reconstruction, it's pointless to spend money twice and redo the pavement twice. So even though they're paying under their permit fee to open the street a significant amount of money for the pavement, which also depends on the condition of the pavement as well. The newer the street, the more they pay. If it's in the queue for our reconstruction, we generally tell them, listen, make the patch as passable as you can. to our standards for temporary patches, and then we'll be coming in behind you and redoing the road. From Winchester Street, we also try to make every effort to get all the other utility work in there done before we actually go in and put a brand new road in. We discourage anybody, including the utilities, from digging up our new streets. So we make every attempt to get them to do their work before we do ours. This street in particular, Winchester Street, as you know, you're a resident there, had a lot of gas work done by National Grid, and we were pushing them to get done so that we can get our work done as well.
Right. And just to follow up on that, and I should, if this is the case, then I should probably know it, but is there a way that residents could look up their street and figure out what the plan is, to the extent, if there is a plan for their street, to be able to find that online somewhere?
I don't believe that there's a lot of data. We have a lot of roads in Brookline, and we have pavement condition indexes for every single road. So there's a lot of data to post online. However, they can call our office at any time, and we can certainly tell them what the pavement condition index is of their particular segment. And if it's already been scheduled and it's in a queue, we can let them know what that schedule is.
That's great to hear. Thank you, Commissioner. Appreciate you.
Any other comments, questions?
Yes, I understood from the commissioner that the investigation of gas leaks has not happened yet, that will come just before the actual construction. Is that correct?
Well, Winchester Street the gas is all brand new on Winchester Street.
Does that mean there isn't a leak?
No, it doesn't mean that. It means the probability of a leak is very low. They have a brand new main, and they have all new services that are on Winchester Street. So the probability of anything, and they're within 2 years old. So probability of having anything on Winchester Street is pretty negligible. Generally, we would have the gas company anyway just do a drive-through with their sensor equipment to make sure that before we tear the street up, that's not the case. As far as Naples and Gibbs are concerned, absolutely, there'll be a leak inspection done there prior to us beginning.
Okay, any other questions? Thank you, Commissioner. I move approval of contract number PW 20-25, reconstruction of Winchester Street and intersection improvements at Naples and Gibbs with Charles Constructing Company or Contracting Company in the amount of $958,300.75. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Thank you. Question of awarding and executing contract number PW 20-24 for fiber reinforced crack sealing to Superior Seal Coat Inc. in the amount of $38,543. Commissioner, that you again?
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chairman, it is. This is a very small contract, but it's one where we get the biggest bang for our buck. This is the first stage of roadway maintenance that appears on our rehabilitation ladder, as we call it. What this entails is actually going out into a road and sealing all the cracks that are in the road with reinforced fiber. It's almost like a rubber compound. The object here is to reduce any water penetration from getting into the pavement and getting into the road base, where it can do a huge amount of damage over the winter through the freeze-thaw cycle of the road. So when roads have a certain pavement condition index and it warrants us, buying a little bit more time, we generally go in and we do what we call crack sealing. This contract also is the two bidders are both known to us and have worked with us before, and it's being funded under existing fiscal year 20 appropriations.
When will the work start? Is that something you do far in advance of winter, or?
Well, this work will start immediately. In fact, both of these projects will start immediately. The crack sealing one goes very quickly. I believe that we're doing about almost 15,000 feet of roadway under the crack sealing contract. That's nearly 2.8 miles. So, but it goes fairly quickly, and it can be done with very little interruption of traffic. The Winchester Street project will be starting. We'll issue a notice to proceed right away, and that'll be starting shortly.
Great. Any other questions? Okay, I move approval of the awarding and executing of contract number PW 20-24 for fiber reinforced crack sealing to Superior Seal Coat, Inc. in the amount of $38,543. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller? Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
And chair votes aye. Thank you. Next, question of approving extra work order number 4 for work done by Casella Waste Management of Massachusetts, Inc. in conjunction with contract number PW 16-01 curbside collection and processing of single stream recycling in the amount of $75,000. I know why we have to pay that. It really hurts, but Commissioner, walk us through this.
Very briefly, this contract, of course, was awarded in fiscal 16. It was a 5-year contract, and it actually expires in a few weeks. We've been working over the last several months to negotiate a contract extension with Casella for both single stream recycling and solid waste disposal and hauling. We've been very successful. I think we're at a point now where we have a very good deal to go forward for another 5-year contract extension, and I will be coming before you sometime in the next several weeks, probably on the 16th of June, to ask for your consideration on approving that contract amendment. But this particular extra work order is to cover the remaining estimated costs for the month of June for the processing of single stream recycling. As you alluded to, Mr. Chairman, the cost of processing recycling has really been a drain on our budget this year, well, last year and this year. It seems to be getting progressively worse. The original contract approval for this year included $1,228,626, which is for the curbside collection of recycling, and an estimate of $320,000 for processing of the recycled materials, which has been purely due to the adverse market conditions. When the market conditions are good, we actually make money on our recycling. When they're marginal, we like to be able to break even, but for the past several years, because of the Chinese sword program, as I've told you about many times before, the market has really gone into the tank, and we're paying a lot of money. It's estimated, we now have numbers through the end of May. It's estimated for to include the month of June, we'll need this additional $75,000 as an extra work order on the original contract award that you did earlier to finish this fiscal year. We're not asking for transfers or reserve fund transfers as we have in the past. We do have the funds in our budget to cover this, but nonetheless, we need an extra work order.
Thank you. Any questions? Further commiseration over our situation in this.
Papastergian, I'm sorry. Could you remind us what the schedule is for those Chinese business people who were going to bring refurbished recycling plants here? And I think you had originally estimated it would be about 1.5 years, and that was a year ago, January, but I don't know, maybe COVID affected that, or there are other factors, do you know?
I'm being told that the plants, these are paper processing plants that are being built in Maine, and I'm being told that that they are on schedule. I think they're still probably at least maybe 7 to 8 months, perhaps even a year away from becoming operational. But but keeping that consideration of that, I was very successful in the negotiation of a new contract with Casella for recycling to get them to rear end load the contract, so to speak, on the processing costs. And my thinking behind that is to get a break for our budget in the first 3 years of the contract on the recycling processing, push the heavier costs to years 4 and 5, hoping and well, praying that the recycling market has come back by then, which makes the whole processing cost and that part of the contract a moot point, because at that point, hopefully we'd be making money on it again, or at least breaking even. So I was very surprised when the contractor agreed to that, but that nonetheless they did. And I'll tell you more about that when I come up to see you on the 16th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll
Any
just,
other questions?
I'll just
Mr.
comment
Franco.
that this is an example of a pressure that the town and the Public Works Department in particular has been experiencing for several years now, predating COVID-19 and the revenue shortfall that caused. So we find ourselves in a constellation of problems, some pandemic related and some just economic condition related. And here we see an example of the latter.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Okay, I move approval of extra work order number 4 for work done by Casella Waste Management of Massachusetts in conjunction with contract number PW 1601, curbside collection and processing of single stream recycling in the amount of $75,000. All in favor, Mr. Franco?
Aye.
Ms. Heller?
Aye.
Ms. Hamilton?
Aye.
Mr. Fernandez?
Aye. Aye.
And chair votes aye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, going on to our calendar items. First item, annual town meeting warrant article, public hearing. This is for warrant article 8, the town budget, the main article in our annual town meeting. We're going to have a public hearing today, but we won't have a vote. We just recently received the materials, which is a summary, the summary section from the town's fiscal year 21 financial plan. We're going to have a meeting on Monday and possibly a later meeting to dive deeply into the budget and address some of the many questions that have been posted online and in our email boxes over the last week or so. You should review the summary very carefully, but also include a review of the financial plan, which is either online or we received copies back in February in preparation for our meeting on Monday and subsequent meeting. Fortunately, Mr. Franco will be with us at the Monday meeting, as he'll still be a member of this board, so we'll be able to benefit from his insights and historical knowledge of these processes. So
I just want to renew my belief that a Monday meeting is not the best course of action. I think any meeting of substantive nature on the eve of the election is the wrong path forward. But that's my 2 cents.
What time Monday? I haven't been told about this meeting.
I thought Mr. Kleckner circulated an email on this a couple days ago. Is that true, Mr. Kleckner? I mean, I seem to have gotten one.
Yes, I failed to follow up with you, Select Board Member Hamilton. I hadn't heard from you, but I don't think we actually set a time specifically. I don't recall. That
And probably the usual time, 5:30, 6 o'clock.
I'm just going to go ahead and agree with Mr. Franco that I think if we can get the meeting the day after the election to happen, I think that would be most appropriate.
Well, what do other people think?
Well, aside from the fact that we'll miss Ben Franco's wisdom, because it's Wednesday after the election and he'll no longer be with us. I also have another meeting that night, so it has been scheduled for a while and it's likely to run till 8 or 8:30 anyway. So I wouldn't be available.
I'm not available on Wednesday. So it's
Okay.
after 7.
Okay. What, Devin? Why don't, Devin? You're still there, right? Why don't we ask Devin to find a time when we can meet? Look, we can't have a discussion of the budget tonight, and we're running out of time. Having a substantive discussion on the 16th when we are going to vote on the budget, this doesn't make any sense to me. So we've got to find a time after the 9th when we're not meeting, unless people want to meet on election day. We have to find a time to have a substantive discussion of the budget after you've had an opportunity to review both the summary report as well as dig deep into the financial plan that report is related to. So, Devin, can you find
I'll coordinate.
Okay. Come up with a plan. You're off the hook, Ben. But any thoughts?
Unless we do Thursday night.
All right, that's an idea. We'll get you, Ben.
Yeah, just to be clear, it's not about my unwillingness to participate. It's just I think it's, this is going to be a major discussion with lasting impacts, and I just think that doing it right before the clock expires on me is, I think there's a better path forward.
That wasn't the reason, but so we'll figure out a time to have a substantive discussion of the budget. For the time being, Mr. Kleckner, would you like to make your presentation?
Sure. If I could, Mr. Chair, I'd like to just follow up on a couple of things that were said tonight. Didn't have an opportunity, or I guess with Mr. Franco's case, I thought we might see him one more time. But I also wanted to share my admiration for Ben Franco's service on the select board. Ben, as you know, is a person who's very intimately familiar with the way government works. He is particularly skilled at regulation and land use and has been really helpful in fostering a lot of compromises and solutions to some detailed and sometimes complicated neighborhood issues that deal with both business, commerce, and residential nature. He was very active in some development projects, but did so in a really, I think, balanced manner. We'll really miss him. I'll miss you personally, Ben. Known Ben since I've come here when he was on the advisory committee, and really happy to have worked with him. So congratulations, Ben, and thank you. And thanks for serving for another month.
Thank you, Mel.
I also just want to say thank you. Jeff Nutting thanked a lot of people, but I want to thank Jeff. Jeff, as I think all of you know, is a longtime city manager, retired individual I've known for a long time. And I know Jeff, and I know he would take this task on, even though most city managers have never run elections before because they're usually in a different jurisdiction than our administrative. He's done a great job. I also want to thank Linda Goldberg, who's the assistant town clerk, who's done a great job. And also I want to acknowledge that even Pat Ward, who I know is undergoing long-term rehab, has been involved, and I talk to him and update him frequently. And just want to say hello to Pat. And so looking forward to next week's election, and I thank you all for your support, as Jeff previously stated. But tonight, I want to release my thoughts and recommendations on the revisions to the fiscal year 21 budget. And I just wanted to say that, it's unfortunate that the changes that came through and impacted our economy and our budget happened so late and so quickly, but that's the way it works. And we are obligated to have some form of a budget in June prior to the fiscal year beginning on July 1st. And one of the things I want to say, and I have a slide that talks about it in more detail, is that I see this budget that the revisions that I'm presenting to you this evening as really the first and interim step of a two-step process. I believe that the town should try to pass as best a balanced budget as it could, understanding the inadequacy of the information that we have to date, but that we really use the fall, and in particular the special town meeting that the town schedules in the fall, that often is used to just tweak the budget. But this year, I believe it really ought to be used as the final and comprehensive discussion of our fiscal year 21 budget. And I appreciate that it's late and after the fiscal year has already begun, but I believe, and I'll go through this a little later, that we really deserve to have the public weigh in, of course, but also let our advisory committee and our other experts and folks in the community who are so active to help us develop good solutions to this really vexing problem. So let me begin. You mentioned, Select Board Chair Green, I did submit to you today a supplement to the budget, which really serves as replacing a supplement to our original budget book, our budget financial plan document. We are not going to produce a new financial plan document because I would say 95% of it has not changed. But we have decided to put the budget summary together, a revised budget summary that can in one place pretty much show everybody what the changes are to the fiscal 21 budget. And we will eventually integrate that into the budget document that sits online. And in fact, that's really the future of our budget document. It's not a published document. It's really a live document online that can be viewed and downloaded and maneuvered around. So let me get into a presentation. I have prepared a slide deck this evening to try to get through a lot of information in a quick manner. So Deputy Town Administrator Melissa Goff is here helping me with the slides, and also, as you know, she's the budget officer of the town, so she knows a lot more about this budget than I do, and will help answer questions. So next slide, please. So this is a busy budget, but busy slide, but I did want you to understand, how we've gotten here, and I think it's really important. So I think the first thing I want to make sure everybody knows is that we have already submitted a budget for fiscal 21, and that was back on February 15th after many months of budget preparation and engagement with a lot of folks. We did put together a balanced budget on February 15th. It was a $359 million budget, which was increased by almost 7%, mostly due to major capital projects that had debt exclusion override increases. It was part of a 3-year override plan, and this was the 3rd year. We actually, if for those of you who don't know, we are actually raising money in the tax levy from this 3rd year override. We still have a little bit of tax levy to raise in the fiscal year 21 budget from the override, and we're doing that. But we were also going to fund some non-property tax revenues, and that was part of that 3-year override plan. And then that budget really did a great job in investing in CIP and reserves, much of which was advocated by our Brookline Financial Advisory Committee, BFAC. But as we all know, COVID-19 happened and impacted our economy and the town's budget beginning in early March. And it was a very rapid and comprehensive impact on our economy. And I think we're still reeling from it. In Massachusetts alone, about 900,000 people have already filed for unemployment compensation since COVID-19 has effectively shut the economy down. So I know you all know the sectors of the economy that shut down, which were most sectors of the economy, especially those that Brookline enjoys and can derive some revenue from. So we have been working since April on developing some revenue projections and looking about what the budget shortfall from this economic impact would be. on our fiscal year 21 budget, as well as fiscal 20, the current year we're in. But in terms of for fiscal year 21, we began to develop 3 different revenue projection scenarios. We used a lot of historical data. This isn't the first time we've had an economic recession. So we tried to look at some prior situations, scenarios where we did see reductions in state aid and local receipts like we will in COVID. And we looked at see what other think tanks were talking about. We listened to the Mass Taxpayers Foundation and anybody else, any other economists and folks that are trying to project the impacts on the economy. And so what we did is we settled on a composite scenario in the middle somewhere, and we settled on a $12.7 million shortfall in revenues based on our analysis. And then we further did some work just last week, really, that brought that shortfall down to $12.1 million. And that was directly related to your decision last week on supporting, at least at this point, on a parking meter rate increase, which was part of the 3-year override plan. But once COVID happened, we were unsure whether to go that far. So now we're sitting with a $12.1 million budget shortfall. That's not an easy thing to resolve at this point in time. When July 1st, the fiscal year is staring us down the throat, and frankly, I didn't feel like the town administrator, who's an appointed administrator of the town, really should be the ones who are making all the decisions and thinking through some solutions to this. So, as you know, I convened the Town School Partnership Committee, which is often a committee that convenes during budget time. It has the benefit of having 2 members of the select board, 2 members of the school committee, and 2 members of the advisory committee. And so I believe we've had at least 3 meetings of the Town School Partnership meetings since COVID began. They've been very useful during the interim periods. All these individual boards, the select board, the advisory board, and the school committee convene on their own and inform the next meeting of the group. And as you know, we've had a couple of discussions of the budget, and I found it to be very, very useful. So the budget policy issues are use of free cash and reserves, funding the capital improvement plan, BFAC's recommendation on stabilization fund deposit, the timing and length of this budget problem, whether it's a 1-year, 2-year, or longer problem. And all of these are would helped inform me in putting together my initial budget recommendations. And so this is the start of that new process, looking at those revisions. I mentioned previously that I see this budget as a two-step process. The first step is when the town convenes on June 23rd for its annual town meeting, we need to have a budget in place by July 1, 2020, or we cannot spend any funds. So we need to do that. And that's why I put together this budget. But I acknowledge it's an interim budget. It's based on very limited data, information. Congress is still working through a lot of issues. So I believe the November special town meeting is the proper time to finalize our budget and really reckon with all of the big policy issues that are going on. But as I mentioned, we have to have a balanced budget by July, and then we have to have a final budget by January 1, 2021. And that's when the town sets its tax rate. Right in the middle of the fiscal year, the first 2 tax payments are estimated, and then the final 2 are based on this final budget. So November works for that. A little later than I would like, but I think it's about right. And as I said, we'll have a lot more information at that time. Just go back to that slide, and also hopefully we'll have a lot more information about federal aid. You just go back to that slide prior, Melissa. Thank you. And then the last point I would make is we really haven't had much public input. I mean, obviously tonight is a public hearing, a required public hearing, because it's on the warrant, and we have articles on any articles that the select board is going to take up. But I believe we need a lot more public input, and I'm sure we'll get it beginning tonight and throughout the fall. So with that, I'll move on to some of the highlights of this revised budget. As I mentioned again, we're talking about a budget shortfall of $12.1 million. And that is, again, from the prior fiscal year 21 budget that we submitted on February 15th. That budget shortfall is made up of state aid reductions. So I think it's pretty clear that the state's being impacted a great deal from the COVID-19 economic impacts, and will be providing less aid to its cities and towns. And this is a guesstimate that we're making. We also are going to be impacted significantly by local receipts. And so that's where most of this 12 million shortfall comes from, 8.8 million of it. And I'm going to get into some of those specific reductions in revenues that we're projecting. Capital budget, that is a big one. So I have made a decision to reduce the capital budget by $3.5 million in order to make more funding available and to mitigate the reductions in staffing and direct services. And I feel strongly about this because my feeling about COVID-19 and the crisis we're facing, it's new. We have to be innovative and creative and engage more with the public. And at the time when we most need our personnel, especially the direct people out there to help our community, we're facing this budget shortfall. So I've tried to do whatever I could to eliminate that. The capital budget was the biggest factor in reducing the impacts of this shortfall. And we'll talk a little bit about it. It's really felt in the school classroom capacity fund and park renovation projects. Departmental operations. So after reducing doing whatever we could on the revenue and then reducing the capital budget, we're left with a shortfall. And that the only place left, other than potentially looking at some reserves and long-term obligations, is where we spend our money. And that's in the school department and in the various municipal departments. And so what we have done is we've taken that shortfall and just allocated it based on a relative percentage of the budget that was in place or the proposed budget that was in place on February 15th. Basically just taking the same relative percentages of those budgets and carrying it forward and applying the shortfall to those percentages. And so the school department budget has been reduced by $4,362,000 since February 15th, and that's a 3.5% budget reduction. And all municipal departments as a group have been reduced by $3,342,341, which is a 4.1% reduction from the prior submission of the FY21 budget. Reserves and long-term obligations, and this is where I think we've spent most of our time talking about budget policy. Obviously, the town is a big corporation. It's a $350 million corporation. We cannot rely we cannot survive without having reserves in place. And there are many reserve policies and protocols for local governments, especially a town like Brookline, which is considered a AAA rated community. And so we have to be very careful about not taking too much of our reserves or using them for one-time funds that can't be replaced. So as it relates to reserves, I'm opposed. I have not recommended the use of one-time reserves, at least not for what I call year one, which is fiscal 21. I believe COVID-19 is going to be with us for a while, or the economic impacts of COVID-19. And I believe that they will extend into fiscal year 2022, which I'm referring as year two. And I think it's going to get worse, frankly. And so I'm very worried about trying to use all of our availability to get through this crisis in year one. So at this point in time, I am not proposing the use of one-time funds for operating budget purposes. I am proposing that we not increase our OPEB contribution of $250,000, but not dip into the OPEB fund itself. And stabilization fund versus annual reserve is a discussion that I'll discuss in just a moment. And then I want to finally say that we have a lot of new costs and new challenges with COVID-19, but we have been directed by the state to not budget for them. And the reason for that is because there is federal funding available to reimburse cities and towns on COVID-19 related expenses. We start with FEMA. We can use the federal CARES money. potentially some CDBG, but the state is telling us don't budget for direct COVID expenses because there's another source of money, and it's federal money. So this budget does not include any direct COVID-19 expenses because there's another pool of money for those. And we want to take advantage and obviously use other folks' money to support the town's expenses. So I'm going to get into all these details a little later. Going back to the local receipts, so the kind of local receipts that are impacted in a scenario situation like this are those revenues that the town is able to levy on business activity. So most of our revenue comes from the property tax, but we also have a lot of other excise taxes or other local charges, permits, and fees that we levy on business activity. Buying cars, we take advantage of a motor vehicle excise tax that the state allows us to levy. We're projecting that's going down by 5%. Interestingly, auto sales really haven't been impacted so far a significant amount through the COVID-19. Our local option taxes, 45% reduction. Hotel and motel excise tax, meals tax, which includes drinks and meals at restaurants, and of course, adult sales of marijuana. All going down, have been shut down for most of the last couple of months, and just now are starting to get back in. But by July 1st and for several months in perhaps all of fiscal 21, we expect all that activity to be really depressed, and as a result, going to experience about a 45% reduction in local option taxes. Our parking fees, the board did authorize enforcement, for fiscal 21, but we're expecting a 50% reduction in that area. Other ones, interest income, the money that the town makes on its money. We're going to have less money in the bank, I think, and we're not sure about the economy, so we're reducing that. And a big one, the one on the bottom, is actual parking meters, not the parking enforcement, but the parking meters. Even though we're increasing the parking rate and other fees, we're going to see a dramatic reduction in parking, at least over the first several months of the fiscal year. So overall, we're seeing a 25% reduction in local receipts, and that's what I think the big thing we're facing, in addition to the state aid reduction. Wanted to talk about municipal department reductions. So with the school department, as you know, the state law does not allow anyone, even town meeting, to tell the school committee how to spend their money. We can only recommend the bottom line budget number. And so that's what we do. That's what I do every year in the budget. And I don't get involved in directing or evaluating specific school budget programs and services, or how they are going to meet that bottom line budget number. But I do this with the municipal department. So part of my budget responsibilities are not only preparing an overall budget, but also making specific recommendations on municipal departments. So we asked all of our departments to do an exercise of looking at their budget as if it was cut by 10%. We did this a few weeks ago. The department heads cooperated greatly and, very sincerely about this. A lot of times, people will do gimmicks and try to figure out ways to avoid budget cuts, but I think everybody understood that we needed to cut some money. So we asked the departments to cut 10% and then start to prioritize these reductions so that we were able to put them together in a plan. And we've done that. My major goals in reducing department budgets were, number one, to minimize reductions in staff and direct service impacts. That goes directly back to my philosophy about COVID-19. It's a new kind of crisis. It requires a lot of creativity and boots on the ground. And so we want to try to minimize staff and direct service and program impacts as much as possible. I also, in addition, we're going to have to reduce staff, but to the extent possible, I want to minimize layoffs of incumbent personnel. Very disruptive. situation for people and families, and hate to do that. As it turns out, we're not there yet. We still have some positions that we would probably require at least longer furloughs or potentially permanent layoffs, but we want to minimize that as much as possible. So what did we do to try to make up $3.3 million in the in municipal departments? Well, it hasn't been pretty. It's been very difficult, but we really wanted to take advantage of some built-in savings. So facilities, programs, and services that have been impacted by COVID-19. So places where people typically gather together physically, library, in the senior center, taking classes or programs at the recreation department. We believe that those will still be in some phase of limited service in fiscal 21. And so we are extending some furloughs and some other activities that would take advantage of some of the budget savings. Granted, they're temporary, but taking advantage of those savings in fiscal 21. We eliminated funding for vacant positions whenever possible, and that goes directly to my goal of reducing layoffs, actual people being laid off. Now, when you eliminate funding for vacant positions, it's not very strategic because they happen somewhat randomly throughout the year. And when COVID hit, we just put the brakes on hiring, and so we developed a whole host of vacant positions, and we're not funding most of them. Some we are, but most we are not. And unfortunately, that's a little random. But again, it's money that's available, and we're going to take advantage. I'm going to take advantage of that. The third is eliminating new investments. This is sort of the last one in is the first one out. Every year, the town tries to incorporate some new investments in its budget. This year, I'll go through them where I'm cutting them. Those are we haven't even funded them and even done that yet. So they were in the original February budget. They're no longer. Most of those are no longer in the budget based on the revisions. And then finally, trying to reduce office supplies, equipment replacement, and other low impact accounts. Again, that's sometimes that's not a great long-term budget strategy, but we're looking for all the options we can without reducing headcount. So we reduced in a number of cases in most departments, office supplies, replacement of equipment, and other low impact accounts. And so bottom line, however, is we are still looking at reduction of about 23 full-time equivalent positions on the town side, which is very troubling. So why don't we tell you where those are? Actually, this is the first slide. This is fine. This is fine, Melissa. So this slide is hard to see. It's in your document, but these are the reductions by department. So just the overall reductions by department, which equal the $3.3 million that we needed to cut. You'll see that these aren't uniform. Some are larger than others, and a lot of that happens, as I just mentioned, where some of the vacancies exist or where some of the new programs came in that had to be reduced, but also the size of departments. Sometimes small departments are almost impossible to cut. It's hard to cut half of a department head or something like that. So sometimes you'll see variable percentage reductions. So it's not perfect by any means, but this is where we made our first cut. So let's get into the next. So these are some of the staffing reductions. You'll see in the building department, a building inspector. That's one of the new positions. Public Works Department, 3 positions there, which are currently vacant. In the fire department, a position that's vacant, and a fire prevention lieutenant, which was part of the new position that would have really helped out with some of the non-firefighting, some of the administrative and regulatory aspects of the department. In the library, significant. There's 1 vacant position, but more importantly, the library is one of those departments that has been closed for some time, and I think will take a while to get back up. And the library director has identified a potential program where it would revise its hours in not only in the village, but also on the other two branches for a period of time in fiscal 21. So not the whole year. So we would continue to furlough a number of staff, and as the library takes a while to ramp up. Economic development, there is 1.5 vacant positions. I should tell you now, and I've told the Climate Action Committee last night, that I will retain the sustainability position. It's the only one the town has, and I'm committed to it. We did defer its replacement until the middle of fiscal year to generate some budget savings. But as you may know, the Collins Center is doing their report anyway, so it's going to take some time to identify some of the details of that position. But I did want you to know that the sustainability position is one of the few vacant positions that will be retained in the FY21 budget. Under the police department, we have loss of a police officer with a vacancy, traffic clerk and meter collector on continued furlough. And again, that's the concept of parking and traffic is not back to where it was and won't be for a while. And we're going to try to take advantage of some of those temporary situations. The select board is not immune. We have a part-time office assistant who we have furloughed through the COVID-19 crisis and will continue to do so. So, excuse me. And then Council on Aging, half the time house worker that's been furloughed continued there. I will say on the Council on Aging that they had a number of smaller part-time positions that were funded through a formula grant that the state provided. And what we're going to be doing is using that formula grant to help the town's budget out, basically. So there will be some loss of some other part-time personnel in the Council on Aging, but they felt it was necessary to keep the full-timers and the more permanent positions on board. Let's move on. Capital budget, as I mentioned before, huge reduction here. I never thought we would.
Excuse me, Mr. Fletcher, could we go back to the list of reductions personnel? Sure. I just want to ask you to make clear to the audience that what furlough of a town employee means in terms of benefits, in terms of their ability to receive unemployment benefits, if any.
Thank you, Chairman Green. I should have mentioned that furlough is essentially a temporary layoff, although it's not actually a layoff because those employees are guaranteed their position when it comes back, so they don't have to reapply. And also, the town has agreed to continue its health insurance benefit for any furloughed employee. Very significant. We pay 83% of premiums for health insurance. And, those employees on furlough are eligible for unemployment compensation, including the federal pandemic bonus. So I know that's not forever, but those employees would be eligible for unemployment compensation as long as they were on that furlough.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. So on the capital budget, again, a big one, we reduced $3.5 million, and that is directly to mitigate the impacts to staffing and direct service impacts. That's not only for the town, but also the school department that shares in the benefit of reduction in the capital budget. Really two major areas where this was felt. The largest area was in our reduced funding for our classroom capacity. So we lease a lot of spaces, and normally leases aren't part of a capital budget, but in this case, we've considered them part of our capital budget because it's really a temporary situation in lieu of more permanent capital projects for the town. So we've been pretty aggressive in trying to lease spaces. And this particular capital item, we have been pre-funding it because we know it's going to grow larger if we don't get ahead of it. And so there is some extra funding, if you will, in the capital budget for classroom capacity. I think we're, in the past have trying to added to it whenever we could because we know, it's going to be a lot. But for fiscal 21, we think we have $2.5 million that we can reduce from that. I will say it's going to require some difficult choices going forward about leases. But at least for the time being, we'd like to grab that $2.5 million. It's not needed specifically for leases. It's really there for funding a capital program going forward. And we also are reducing, let me go through the next one. So the remaining operating revenues that is going towards the capital budget is $12,735,000. And the point I want to make about that is that does not meet the town's policy of how much our operating revenue should go towards capital. We have had for a long time a policy that says the operating revenue has to get to at least 6% of the prior year net revenue. And this $12,735,000 amount, which has been reduced by the 3.5%, does not meet that 6%. I think it's around, I don't know, 4.5%.
4.5.
4.5. Thank you, Melissa. But the overall policy that when you add from operating revenue and free cash and other sources, we need to get to 7.5%. And our fiscal 21 capital budget does meet that. So we are going to spend $21 million on capital, and that does meet the overall 7.5% policy. But I did want you to know that the operating revenue does not meet the 6% of prior year net revenue. Now, that's a town policy. It's a discretion. It's actually adopted by this board. So there's no state law or any impediment to modifying that policy, but it would require a vote from the select board.
And that vote will come up probably next meeting?
Before July 1st. Okay, so let me get to the capital budget. So these are just the reductions, I believe. Is that right, Melissa?
Yes, so I've been engaged with the capital subcommittee of the advisory committee. And so they've been also reviewing the capital plan. And so there are some variances from they're also trying to get to the same target of 3.5 million. I'm confident that we'll reconcile and be on the same page. But I did want to note the areas where we are in agreement and where our recommendations are a little bit different from the capital subcommittee. Full committee of advisory still has yet to vote on the capital subcommittee's recommendations.
Thank you, Melissa. I do want to say so these are reductions, but what I want to say first is what is being funded. And as I previously said, there's over 12 million or 20 million being funded on capital. So my philosophy and goal strategy is to use the capital budget at a minimum to continue to maintain our assets, our major infrastructure, roads, sidewalks, transportation systems, traffic calming measures, bike and pedestrian accommodations, trees, major building systems, and those kind of things. That's where I want to. That's where I believe the town should spend its money, and where we need to retain our assets. Where I felt that the town could reduce, I mentioned previously the classroom capacity, but also any individual projects that could be deferred, or we could find alternative funding sources for. So you'll see those. I think the most significant one that I see on this list, in addition to classroom capacity, which is really more of a longer term decision, is the Robinson Playground. So that is a one over $1 million. Melissa, is this the construction project?
So the design of this project has already been funded in a previous appropriation. This would be for the construction. I think, the thinking around this recommendation is to wait until November. And if things improve in November, we may have a different take on this particular project.
Well, I think that's the case for a lot of things in this budget. I think we need more information. But at this point, Robinson Playground, unfortunately, is on the cut list here. But as Melissa said, this is an area that the advisory committee has stepped up and has been working on. And, I'm happy to collaborate with them, as I'm sure you are. And we'll hear from them shortly about how they feel about all of this stuff, but in particular, the capital budget.
So Robinson Playground is bond funded. So are we able to use the savings for the operating budget? We had to pay off the bonds.
Not much in fiscal 21, but I believe so. Melissa, do you want to?
So this is just the authorization for the $1.15 million. So if you look at, if you sum the total, you'll see that that is not included in what I'm counting towards the revenue finance reductions. What it's essentially doing is preserving some flexibility that we potentially would need in fiscal 22, because if we borrow for this project in 21, the debt service on it would be due in fiscal 22.
I see. Where is Robinson Playground? Yes, I should know that.
It's on Cypress Street. At the foot
Oh,
of,
right. I know where it is.
of High
Yeah.
Street Hill. Yeah.
Yep, got it.
I want to move on to reserves and long-term obligations. So that is the area I think has received most of the concern or interest in seeing if this could be a solution to our fiscal 21 or longer-term budget issues, or at least our COVID-19 related issues. Let's talk about it. And I believe we'll continue to have this discussion as we go through the fall. But let's talk about this. So our reserves. We have really two, what I would call official reserves. One is the stabilization fund. It is the town's savings account. And over the years, but nothing recently, I don't recall, the town has put away about $6.7 million to the stabilization fund. And our policy, our local policy, is that it really has to be, an emergency and other conditions to take money out of that. Obviously, this was the source of a lot of the BFAC concern over the BFAC report, where the stabilization fund, when combined with other reserves, was not meeting what they considered to be the minimum that's required of a community like Brookline to retain its AAA bond rating and all the benefits that go with that. So, as you might recall, they were interested in appropriating $2 million from our fund balance to the stabilization fund to make sure it just gets stuck there and that it gets the benefit that Moody's would provide. Moody's, our bond rating agency. At this point, I'm willing to put $1 million into the fund balance, from the fund balance into that, but no more. Then we get to free cash. Free cash, kind of a strange word that we use. No other state uses this word to refer to its unreserved fund balance from year to year. But the town has $14.4 million in that account. We use it for capital to meet our capital and operating reserves, and we're doing so again this year. I am going to recommend that part of the use of free cash is to deposit into the housing fund, the affordable housing fund, when that balance falls below 5 million. I believe we're shortly under 5 million and propose to put $700,000 or so into the housing fund. And I'm just asking that we hold off on that at least until the fall. Not saying we wouldn't do that, but so not using any stabilization fund money or any free cash other than what we usually use for the capital budget added to this budget. So I want to be very clear about that. And the reason I'm saying that is because of that multi-year concern I have about the COVID crisis. And then finally, long-term liabilities. So in addition to reserves, we're putting a lot of money aside, not so much for savings, but what I call it as paying down the town's credit card. So the town, as an employer in Massachusetts, is not part of the Social Security system. So all of our employees are part of a Massachusetts contributory retirement system, and the town and the employees fund that. But they haven't over time. It has for many decades. Excuse me. Cities and towns have just paid as you go on pension funding, and sooner or later, several years ago, the state government determined that towns could no longer do that. That they had to set their pension funding liability in place and put together a funding plan to meet that. And so this town has been doing that for many years. We're putting $26.7 million into that account in fiscal 21. There is possibility of savings. Go back to the prior slide for just a little while longer. Pardon me. So on pension funding, it is possible to relook at our pension funding plan over time. It's done by an actuary built on dozens of assumptions. We have asked the actuary to take a look at it. It's too late to really do anything about that for fiscal 21, but they are going to be looking at a number of potential ways to create some operational budget savings for fiscal 22. And then we have OPEB, which is referred to as other post-employment benefits. And basically, it's health insurance for our retirees. So it's not covered in pension, but in Massachusetts, cities and towns in the state cover their retired employees for health insurance for as long as they live, and their survivors too. And that's obviously a huge expense, especially as health care has ballooned over the last couple of decades. And similarly to pensions, we have an unfunded liability that we're trying to get a handle on. Different than the pension funding, OPEB does not have a required payment, but being a fiscally responsible community, AAA community, we have begun to put money aside for OPEB. And we are currently putting $4.8 million of our budget into OPEB. Again, I am not recommending that we take money out of our credit card payment, if you will, but I am suggesting that we could reduce the incremental increase in the OPEB payment, and that $250,000 that's listed there is part of that. So before we move on, I think we should talk about reserves and long-term obligations. I think we're going to have a lot more discussions about these in the fall, but happy to answer any other questions at this time.
Let me ask one question. I thought in a previous discussion, the OPEB payment for this year was set at 4.4 million. Was that a mistake, or has this changed? Or am I wrong?
Maybe the 4.8 reflects other enterprises like water, sewer, and other the golf course and other. But maybe Melissa, you could clarify that.
Yes, I think that's referring to just this is all funds. We get contributions from the golf enterprise, the revolving fund, recreation revolving fund, the retirement fund. But I'll confirm that number once I'm able to exit from this PowerPoint.
Okay. Secondly, maybe a difficult question to answer, but if at national level there is some form of national health insurance, that I assume is going to significantly impact our OPEB liabilities.
Well, if you're saying that the government would contribute to health insurance,
I mean, Medicaid for all, for example, is one idea. Or some variation.
Most of our employees, despite not being in the Social Security system, are eligible for Medicare. So when they retire, at least they're going on Medicare, and we're taking supplemental. But I'm not expecting the federal government to pay for employee health insurance.
Okay. What is the balance of the OPEB account, OPEB trust fund?
So OPEB is currently funding approximately 16% of the liability. It's approximately 60 million.
60 million, okay.
Mel, can I ask a question about, so as you mentioned before, a lot of folks have asked us two things. One, and we can talk about the other later, an override, but especially about tapping the reserves during this time. And I don't know about, I think members of the board have probably gotten about 40 or 50 emails at this point about these issues. And I know that you've recommended against it. I just want to know a couple questions. One is there any scenario going forward? And I know you mentioned that it might be in year 2 something that that you might consider recommending. I guess what are the conditions under which you might recommend tapping into reserves? Is one question.
Sure. I think two things. Number one, it would have to be a lot worse than 3.7% reduction in a budget. Number one, and number two, there'd have to be some sense that when this is over, we're going to be able to find the money to replace, that one-time source of revenue.
And if what is the mechanism in which, and again, understanding that it is not being recommended at this time, but what is the mechanism in which funds would be able to be pulled from reserves? Does that require a town meeting vote or
yes.
How does that work?
Yes, town meeting vote.
Okay, right. All right. I have other questions that I think I'll save for later, but those are about the reserves.
It requires a 2/3 vote from town meeting.
2/3 vote from town meeting.
For a stabilization fund withdrawal, correct.
So
Mel, could I follow up with on Raul's question?
Certainly.
If we were to dip into those reserves, what would be the effect on our AAA bond rating, which saves us hundreds of thousands of dollars because the bond interest rate we pay when we are a AAA community is much less than the bond interest we would pay if we're not a AAA community, correct?
Yes, the AAA has many benefits, financial and otherwise. But I think the answer to the question, we don't know. All things being equal, taking money out of your savings fund to fund operating expenses is not an accepted municipal or any practice, any good financial practice. So people are going to look at that, not unlike if you did it in your family. If you're using your savings to fund ongoing expenses, and then once the savings are done, your ongoing expenses continue to increase. So that's not generally a good idea. But and I think the bond rating agencies will look unfavorably on that. But what the bond rating agencies tell us typically is when there's a crisis like we're facing, as long as the taking money out of savings or perhaps not putting in the OPEB payment is part of a longer term plan that is a temporary situation, but still longer term to kind of get back to where you were, or to somehow smooth out the where you're going to be at the end, the new normal, so to speak. And so I'm just concerned that year one may be too early to make those judgments. That's really where I'm at on this. I would, of course, argue to Moody's and anybody else who was critical of the town why we were doing it and try to develop a plan if we were going to do that. But, I think there is a risk for sure that the town's AAA bond rating would be reduced.
Thank you.
Mel, can you just talk a little bit about what the multi-year impact of tapping into free cash would be? It's my impression that it's less reserves and more like a checking account. And if we pull money out of it in a current year, it's got a downstream impact in future years on capital and other expenses for the town.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to remember is we've had a very strong free cash balance. Our fund balances have been very strong over the last few years, and that wasn't by chance. Frankly, we put together very conservative budgets and estimates, and we knew that since we use free cash to fund our capital plan, and we knew how extensive our capital plan is, especially school construction, classroom capacity, that we were trying to expand our free cash, and we did that. I think we were very successful to the point that we had $2 million available to throw into the stabilization fund. But with COVID-19 coming, we are not going to experience those same balances, and so I think there is a risk. In addition to just using free cash in general, I think there's a risk in particular with free cash, because I think those balances are going to be going down in the future years.
Great. Any further questions?
Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. This is free cash, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So this is a fairly old slide. We have to update it, but you'll see that we have $14,392,269 in free cash. And as I mentioned, if you look at that bar chart, the line chart, you'll see that our balances have gone up. Free cash balances have gone up. Now, capital expenditures have gone up at the same rate or even higher. So I think that's to your point, Select Board Member Franco, that we have been getting more free cash, but we've been using it. And so this is the proposal, at least in February, for the use of free cash. There's changes to it, and we haven't updated those. But let me just go down the list. The first is to fund 25% of our operating budget reserve, to keep $2.6 million in the fund for a rainy day checking account type of approach. $2 million for the stabilization fund, which I am going to bring down to 1. I'm recommending go down to 1, and that the other 1 goes into the reserve fund, the operating budget reserve fund. And then 50,000 for our liability reserve, 4.2 for capital improvements, which again is down below. You see additional SNAPP, another 4 million, and then the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is 726, and that is the only one that I'm suggesting we defer at this time. So a lot of discussions about free cash coming up, I'm sure.
Hey Mel, can I ask what a deferral would look like? How to, would we just? Anyway, I'll leave it at that. What would that look like?
We just keep the money in free cash and could reconsider it the next time we meet at town meeting.
Okay. Does that in November? You mean? Okay. Okay. All right. I'll think about that.
Questions about free cash? If not, then this is my final slide. Just looking at phase 1 going forward, we don't have a lot of time left. We talked about a special budget meeting for Monday, but I understand that that's likely to be deferred. But I believe we do need another meeting to really dive deep into the budget before June 16th. The advisory committee is already begun to review their budget, and they're planning on creating a supplemental report to town meeting on June 18th. And I just want to be clear, the budget that's going to town meeting is not this budget that I'm preparing tonight. It's the advisory committee's review of that budget. So that's the way it works in Brookline's form of government. So as much as you want to address my budget recommendations, my guess is, we'll be doing that more in a collaborative way, given the time frame. And then if the board finds that any of the advisory committee recommendations are not acceptable to them, they have the right to submit possible budget amendments. And of course, our town meeting is on June 23rd. So that's the extent of the budget presentation. You have the more detailed report, which will be all going online. And at this point, I'm happy to answer any other questions. And I know you have a public hearing for the warrant article.
Right. Any further questions by the board?
I just, something that didn't come out in your presentation, and I just want to clarify for myself, is there are some line items within the municipal budget which cannot be reduced. They're required to be static, and I'm thinking of things like debt service. Even if we wanted to sort of say we're going to get a couple of $100,000 from there to contribute to a budget, to filling a budget shortfall, we just can't do that because we've already floated the bonds and we're on the hook for it. So if you think about the municipal budget as a pie, we don't have access to the entire pie. We've only got access to a small percentage of it. That's a terrible analogy, but is it an accurate way to describe it?
Well, we could do it, but the rating agencies here at Catch Fire.
No, well, there's some things we can do and some things we can't do. We are obligated to pay our bond payments. You're right. We could go in default, but we're not going to. We have to pay the estate assessment on the MBTA, the county assessment, the health insurance and other contractual obligations the town has. So there are a lot of aspects of the town's budget and the school department's budget as well that really are, we call fixed costs, and there's very little discretion to them. So that makes the remaining discretionary parts of the budget hard to cut. Also want to remove that slide, and we'll bring things up as we need to. Thank you.
And then just something that I've heard from a couple of folks over the last few days is that we should take the money that we raised from debt exclusions and reallocate it to the operating budget. And correct me if I'm wrong, but we're not allowed to do that. A debt exclusion is raising money for a specific capital purpose, and that money has to be used for that purpose. We're legally prevented from diverting it or repurposing it, no matter how bad the situation is.
That is correct. Debt exclusion questions seek voter approval on a very specific project or purpose, and If you want to change that, then you don't get the taxes anymore.
I'm sorry, say that again.
If you don't want to use it for that purpose, then you're unable to levy taxes for that purpose. You know, that was originally allowed.
I've got a couple more questions if I can. Again, this is not about things that I'm trying to recommend, but I'm trying to get answers to the questions that folks have been asking out there. And so with the understanding that that in addition to the town school split, that there are additional costs to the town that go toward the schools. And I think the number is about 65% of the budget goes toward the schools right now from revenues. Is there any way to cut deeper on the municipal side in order to support the schools during this time where there seems to be, I don't know if it's fair to say, maybe you'll tell me if I'm wrong about this, that there seems to be more of a crisis on the school side right now than there is on the town side, but tell me I'm wrong. And if you can just talk about like whether or not, there's any way to cut deeper on the town side in order to support the schools during this time.
Sure, of course there is, and vice versa. So, the town meeting really has control of the budget dollar and can decide to allocate it how it wants to. I'm not going to speak on the school department budget because I don't know it intimately. So I can't compare impacts and, things like that. I just can't do that at this point. So that's something this board, the advisory committee, and ultimately the town meeting will make a determination about.
And I know you mentioned before that that neither the select board nor town meeting has any control over how the school committee and department, once they have the money, how they use those funds. Is there any way for additional funds to be, whether it was through reserves, which you've not recommended, or in any other way, put toward the school side, but with contingencies to say this funding is to shore up programs like ACE and BEEP and others that we've gotten emails about? Is there any way to do that?
Not if you put it under the jurisdiction of the school committee, no.
It's up to them. Once the funding gets there, it's up to them. Okay. And then the last question, totally separate, was I know Melissa had presented to us this past year at some point that in the near future, we're going to need to make some updates to our firehouses. And that potentially in the future, there might be, we might even need to seek some small manner of override to help support that. I just want to know where that is, and just to know, I don't exactly recall how much of that was were safety improvements versus I know there were some other improvements that we needed to make there.
So I can update you on that. So that was originally included in the preliminary CIP. Given the timing with all the Newberry discussion and some other pressure in the CIP, when we put out the final CIP, we pushed that to fiscal 22 because we felt that there was more time that was needed to kind of educate the public about the condition of the firehouses and why the renovations were needed. I think the question is, in light of everything that's going on, is that still a good timeline? And, I think that's something we'll need to consider as we're building FY22 CIP.
Great. And then just very last question, just the other question a lot of folks are asking us about is, what about an override, an operational override? If you can at least tell us obviously it's a question for the board. The board would have to make that determination. But the mechanics of it, maybe if you can just explain those of how it works, the timeline. I think a lot of folks are thinking that maybe this is going to help with the current crisis. My understanding is that by the time those funds would come in, I don't know that it actually would help with what folks are dealing with on the school side right now. If you can just talk a little bit about that process so people understand, it'd be helpful.
Sure, I'm happy to. So Proposition 2.5 limits a city or town to increase their tax levy by 2.5% per year, exclusive of debt exclusions and overrides. And so an override would allow the town to levy more taxes than 2.5% per year. We're in effect, we're already in an override. I mean, this is the third year of the override. We're still generating taxes from the old override. So I suppose you can have two overrides in a year. I've never heard of it, but it's possible. So. But the fact of the matter is that you could put together an override in the fall, and it would have the effect of, I believe, of funding the FY21 budget. You just have to raise the money in the second half of the year because you haven't set your tax rate yet. But I believe you could pass an override in the fall, and it would fund the fiscal 21 budget.
Now, the third
understanding, Melissa.
I would need to review the guidance before I could say that
Yeah,
definitively.
I'm pretty sure that's the case. Many communities pass overrides in the fall, and they have the effect of impacting their current fiscal year that they're in.
Now, we're in the third year of the 2016, I think, override, and that's third calendar year. So if we were to pass an override, let's say next month, it really wouldn't take effect until calendar year 2021. Is that correct?
No, we're talking about fiscal years.
I think, Bernard, I think that was a 2018.
Okay, you're right.
Fiscal 18, yeah.
Yeah.
But the money comes in beginning January 1st, not the beginning of the fiscal year.
That's okay. I mean, there's a lot of money that doesn't come in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. You budget for it, and it's really how much you have for the whole.
No, but that's what I meant by calendar year. The override was for calendar year 2020.
No, it was for fiscal 20.
Okay.
Actually, I think we had it in May of 2018. So I think it was fiscal year 19, 20, and 21.
That is correct.
So that's why Mel says we're going into the third year because we made a 3-year plan that would affect fiscal year 19, which is passed already, fiscal year 20, which is passed, which we're in the second, and fiscal year 21, which starts in July. So we're in a period of a 3-year plan.
Okay. The first and last year are half years. Yeah.
Half calendar years, but not half fiscal years. Yeah.
I guess I'll just close by saying, I'd appreciate if we as a board can find a time to docket a conversation about this, maybe a public hearing about this, and then afterwards see where we are. But I think we should at least explore it as an option, not feeling myself like I'm determined in one way or the other at this point, but at least to have that dialogue and hear from the public on it at some future, maybe soon, relatively soon future point, understanding that we're very busy right now with getting ready for town meeting.
I think it might be useful because I've heard some people ask that we put an override on the ballot next week. And I know we can't do that because of the timing and in state law around the timing of elections, but maybe you could educate people about that. Melissa, I don't know exactly. I thought it was 30, you had to put it on at least 35 days before.
You have to give notice to the town clerk prior to the election. So there are definitely some timing constraints as well.
Right.
That's a good.
Is that where the 35 days comes in?
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. So in terms of just scheduling that conversation, I'd imagine we want to work back from, let's say, if we were to want to put something on the ballot, we already have one on September 1st, for instance. We have an election. No sense in paying for a separate election if we have one coming up, and maybe working backwards so that there's enough time for proper hearings and time for us to think about it and everything before we might possibly vote on something like that.
Just to clarify one thing, so the state primary election on September 1st, we could not have our local ballot, local question on that ballot. We would essentially have to have 2 separate elections on the same day. I think we talked about that with
Oh, that's right. There would be 2 different ballots, but same polling places. You show up, you ask for, yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
So we've been talking about November adjustments, presumably to the good. Like things haven't been as bad as we were anticipating. And fingers crossed, I hope that's what happens. But I just want to acknowledge that it can work the other way as well. If the Goldilocks scenario of roughly $12 million decrease in revenue doesn't come to pass, and the more extreme estimate possibility that's been explored of somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 or $19 million of a revenue deficit comes to pass, then I would assume we would have to go through an exercise of going through the municipal budget and making even more drastic cuts, either to capital or to core operating. So I just want to put that as an idea out there and acknowledge that there's at least, this is a guess, and it can go wrong either way. And I hope it doesn't go wrong in the wrong direction. But
No, I agree. We sure hope so too. And I think, we did use the middle scenario, but it was a composite. We took some bad news and some, not so bad news and put it together. But it's true. And if that happens, we have an obligation, unlike the federal government, to have a balanced budget every year. So we have to have a balanced budget. We have to figure out where that additional money would come from. I think in that scenario, I know Raul asked about, when would you consider recommending use of some other reserves? That might be it if we really found ourselves really under the gun in November.
And I would just remind the board that, we really only have 1 month of data to go off at this point. So, as we get closer to November, we'll have more experience in our local receipts, and that will help us improve those projections.
We should inform when we would put an override on the ballot if we were going to do that, meaning that we would want to be closer to when we have a better information than further away.
So just just to telegraph where my head is at, and I take no pleasure in the pain that we're going to see on both the municipal side and the school side, and I acknowledge that it's incredibly disruptive. To use all the tools in the toolbox now to try and fill a gap when there's the potential that our educated guess may be incorrect and leaves us really with very, very bad options in November, I think would be unwise. I think it would be prudent to hold back at least some less painful strategies for November and not use all the tricks or all the funds available later this month to try and plug some of the holes that we're seeing.
Any further discussion? No? So where do we go next? We have an even deeper discussion. Well, this is a public hearing, so we have to do that.
I think that's weird. What's that noise? I think it is. We just got most of the budget materials today. Do think we need the time to digest them and understand them. So I know we're going to have a meeting on either Monday or some other day next week. Can't be Tuesday, and then can't be Wednesday. For me, it can't be Wednesday. So I guess, we'll have to figure it out.
I think we should have we do need a meeting, interim meeting, sometime after Tuesday the 9th, in order to bring a new board member on, member or members up to speed on the budget and make sure that they're prepared for town meeting.
Right.
I mean, this presentation, I think, goes a long way to really bringing us up to speed, especially when you incorporate or you look also in the fiscal year financial plan booklet. But we'll have a new board, so we need to make sure that everyone is up to speed. So this is a public hearing. Devin, could you identify any members of the public who'd like to speak?
At this time, no one has asked to comment publicly. We do have about 11 attendees. There are no longer any call-in users. but anyone who is present can use the chat or the Q&A function to ask a question. I'm sure you saw there were a couple of questions in the Q&A earlier about schools, which was covered, unassigned balances, which I also think you touched on, and neither of those people are in the meeting any longer.
Well, let's give people a few minutes to, compose their thoughts in case they want to speak. Be very disappointed if we don't have public comment to this part of the budget discussion. Well, while we're waiting for the public.
Bernard, if I could
Yeah.
just add,
Yeah.
the advisory committee will also be meeting on this on Thursday, and I will be in attendance at that meeting as well. So if, this is still, they're still digesting it as well. So there'll be another opportunity this week for more questions to be answered. And I'll be joining them shortly. I'll be hopping into their Zoom meeting after I'm done with the board.
Bernard, you're muted.
Okay, further discussion by the board. Thank you. Any further discussion by the board? I think this has been a useful discussion, identifying some issues we need to think about and that are out in the community that people are concerned about and have questions about. So, is there any further discussion from board members? While we're waiting for the public to pipe up.
I'll just take a minute to say that, thank you especially to Melissa and to Mel and your team for working under extraordinary circumstances, not just dealing with these numbers, but also the way in which you've had to have conversations in a whole new format with department heads and everybody. And it cannot be easy, Mel, to present what you presented earlier to us today about the reductions in a number of different departments, including staffing, which we know for others that are in those departments will need to take on the burden of those responsibilities themselves. And so I just want to recognize how hard this work is for you all, and how knowing a lot of these folks who work with us directly. We're not a huge town, right? And so knowing a lot of these folks, how difficult some of these decisions must be to make. So I just want to recognize that and just say thank you for your work here.
If I could just add my thanks to Justin Casanova Davis and Gina Franconi. They've really been helpful in collaborating on a lot of this. And I would also just like to thank all my colleagues, all the department heads, because, this is tough news to deliver, and it really just the professional nature of town staff. It's been, I really appreciate their ability and cooperation during this process.
Right.
Could I just add, there have been some questions to us in emails and also on the chat tonight about whether we approve of the big layoff notices, those pink slips that were given to teachers. And, I have to say categorically, I'm sure none of us like it. It's very painful. And I do remember when I was on the school committee, we had to do this in the early 90s, and it was awful. Hated it. At least then I had a say in whether, what happened, and we managed to bring it down considerably. But as has been pointed out tonight, the school department has an allocation from the town, plus the town pays for certain other things like health insurance, et cetera. So the contribution of the town budget contribution to the schools is as Raul said, almost 65%. I don't see how we can do more. The town has always, in my opinion, had a very thin structural situation with staff, et cetera, in terms of what we are expecting them to do. And so the cuts to the staff at the municipal level are also very painful. And I hope people will recognize that. They affect people's lives. They're very unsettling. And we're going to do whatever we can on both for the whole budget, not just the municipal budget, for the whole budget to bring these cuts down. We'll try our best. But of course, it's painful. But as I say, we don't have the decisions on the school side. That is statutorily up to the school committee.
As is the requirement to give notice of potential cuts.
Correct. And sometimes
statutorily and by the union contract.
Right. And one of the things because of that issue, they pink slip the people, and then as we're able to work through finding more revenue and figuring out how other ways to manage the budgets, then people are brought back. So we don't know to what extent that'll happen this time. It's always very uncertain. It's very troubling for the employees because they say, well, will I have a job in the fall or will I not? And, it's going to really disrupt my life and et cetera. So it's not fun, and it's really human pain.
Yeah.
So we just have to remember that, and that's true on the town side as well.
So I'll just echo something that was said a couple of times during this meeting, that this is a work in progress, and there's going to be potential for movement and changes over the rest of this month. So this is the very start of the book here, and the final chapter won't be written until the end of the month when town meeting votes on a budget. I do have a question, and I won't ask Mel or Melissa to comment on the specifics of the school budget, but I'm wondering if they can put what we saw tonight in context of recent recessions or budget cuts in Brookline. How does this compare to 2008 and the level of reductions that we've had to make and the impact that we're potentially going to have on municipal services?
Oh, I'll speak first. And Melissa was here in 2008, so I didn't arrive until 2010, but I've been in Massachusetts local government my whole career, and I can tell you that I've experienced this a number of times, a sort of recession or for whatever reason, economic impacts that impact a budget. I think the problem with this one is it just came out of the blue, and no time to plan, no time to sort of prepare for it whatsoever. Most of the time, you're gradually, it might take you a couple of fiscal years, maybe 3 years to get through an economic cycle. Here, it was just like that, and that's the difference for me. A 3.7% budget reduction in the big scheme of things, nothing's easy, and I think Nancy said, the town tends to budget pretty conservatively, pretty carefully, and so there's not a lot of fat around. So 3.7 is nothing to sneeze about, but overall, historically, that wouldn't be, the biggest thing that's ever happened. I think the difference in this time, it just happened so quickly, and we don't know when it's going to be over.
I see that Dave Gasich has a comment. Devin, can you let him in?
I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dave Gashok, town meeting member, Precinct 13, and a Heath School parent. Didn't want you to be without any public comment tonight, so
always depend on you.
I just want to urge everyone to remember that this is a very painful time, but it's hopefully a short-term time. And whether short-term means 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, there's going to be a time, cross all of our fingers, that we're going to come out of this within a school year or two and a fiscal year or two. And we're going to want to do so in a way that we haven't crippled our ability over the long term to keep providing the school and town services that we all cherish so much. And so I would urge the select board, as I will urge town meeting and the advisory committee and the school committee, to take steps now that give flexibility. And I know that's become a rather loaded term around last week's pink slips, but flexibility in the other direction. Overrides authorize tax increases. They don't compel them. Town meeting votes to authorize town staff and the select board to spend reserve funds, lowercase r, don't compel those funds to be spent if they're not ultimately needed. But it's hard to catch up if you don't put those votes on the agenda or on the calendar. And so as we continue to work through this very uncertain time, I hope we'll all look for every way we can to keep our valued town and school staff, including all of our valued teachers, employed by our town in a way that they can live with and we can live with. And that's going to take some shared sacrifice. But with an eye toward the fact that we're going to come out of this in a year or two, and we're going to want all of that wonderful team together to plan for the years after that, as opposed to having dispersed it to the winds just because we didn't do as visionary a job as we could of managing a short-term, very difficult situation. And so I hope you all will keep in mind and keep thinking through the fact that things that we can do to give ourselves flexibility, including potentially an operating override, may help us do that and may help us come out in a year or two stronger than we otherwise would be. And thank you for all you're doing. This is a very fraught and difficult time, and all of us really appreciate all the work that's going into it.
Thank you, Dave. I don't see any other comments from the public. Any further discussion by the select board?
I was just going to ask if you can tee up how so I can think about it, how our next conversation is going to work. Are we going to be digging deeper into individual line items? What should we expect for the next conversation?
So I'm working on preparing the normal budget table that town meeting votes on that will hopefully provide some structure, and then we'll be looking at some comparisons between what previously we would have prepared and what you currently have in front of you.
And we'll be able to tee up any amendments to the advisory committee budget that we may want to make.
I'll be keeping you informed. Yes, absolutely.
I think just generally, Raul, it's really what you want. I mean, it's whatever information the board feels it needs to evaluate my recommendations as well as those of the advisory committee. The problem with the advisory committee is it's going to take a while. It will be towards the end, like June 14th or 15th. So I think we got to figure out how we can stay in touch with the advisory committee over the next couple of weeks. To coordinate our efforts and make sure they're not at odds with one another. Even though at the end of the day, they could be at odds. And that's when, as Melissa says, you want to draft your changes for town meeting to consider.
I think we also should tee up discussion. I'm not advocating for this, the discussion of an override and look at it from the standpoint of a number of angles, including if things get really bad and we have a override voted, that's going to be more painful for the public. But that discussion should be incorporated into our agendas for the next couple of meetings. We have until July 15th to do something like that for September 1st, at any rate. I see that there's another caller who would like to speak. Devin, could you bring him into the meeting?
We don't actually know if they want to speak, but I did notice a new call-in user joined us, so I'm going to give them the opportunity to give a public comment during the hearing if they'd like. It's 617-913. You're now unmuted if you'd like to contribute to the public hearing on the budget. And that is the remainder of questions, comments, and hand raise emojis.
Select board, I'd like to, okay. Unless there's any further discussion by the select board, I'd like to close this hearing. Any further discussion? Hearing none, and we will vote in the future. Okay, the next item was Article 7, Brookline High School appropriation. Ms. Heller, could you tell us where we are with that?
Sure. A lot of feedback, but so as you know, we submitted this warrant article in early March before any of the COVID stuff hit.
And we have been subject in this project to two major budget factors and a couple of minor ones. The major ones are what I call the galloping escalation. When we put together this original budget in the spring of 2018 for the debt exclusion override, escalation was nowhere near this. Nobody dreamed that it was going to be this high. And we've seen some of the trades be as high as 15%, some 10%, some 8%. Still, we've never seen that before. So that is a complete budget buster. In addition, when we put together the MBTA budget, we relied on input from other communities that have done this, and we put together a budget, the best budget we could with MBTA, estimators. And again, that has proven not to be accurate. We've had many more expenses. The MBTA has required much more from us. So we have a big overage in that account as well. The other smaller issues have been, increased scope, really not much. A plaza for the MBTA, which the community really pressed for, an enlarged plaza. And also we've had some unforeseen conditions. We are attaching, don't forget, we're tearing down a piece of the old, of the Roberts Wing at the high school and building a new Roberts Wing and attaching it to the rest of the project that exists. And when you do that, you run into problems. And unfortunately, the old building is from I believe it's the 1940s, and the drawings are not the as-built drawings are not as explicit as they would be today. So we ran into problems. So we had some, to shore up some structural elements of the old building, as well as take out the original basement level and do a new one, because the risk that there were issues there was too significant. So all of that in the end added up to about $32 million in problem. The good side is that because we told the voters that we would be bonding 205 million, 0.6 times an interest rate of 5%. In all of these things, there's a bucket for, the bond. There's a bucket for the interest. You add those two things up, and you get a third amount, which is the amount that is called your debt service, like a mortgage. Fortunately, the bond market has been such that the bond interest rates have fallen significantly, which we could not have known. And so we benefited by that. And in the long run, if we were to authorize the 32 million, it would not end up actually costing us any more than we said it would cost us in 2018 in the debt exclusion override proposal. So in fact, it would cost us a little less. So that's where we were. But in the meantime, then COVID hit, and that caused significant delays in especially on the MBTA side. And so we've had this, roller coaster of ups and downs with what is this going to mean for the project. It means delays in some cases. It may mean, budget implications in others. And last week, the AC was concerned enough about it that they voted to defer the project request until November, so that they hopefully would have more information. That was on Thursday, and then on Friday,
we got news from good news from the MBTA, which is because that they are going to be doing construction projects on the D line, and they are going to shut the D line down at their own expense for 2 separate weeks in June. And that means that our project, the overbuild on the MBTA on the now 22 Tappan, then 111 Cypress building, will take advantage of that and make significant progress toward completing that piece. It won't be 100%, but so we're analyzing that. Skanska, our construction company, is on top of it. You know what they're planning for the cranes and the materials and all the things they need to do that. And we're in the midst of analyzing what that means in terms of both the schedule and the budget. Don't have the answer yet. So the building committee is meeting at the end of this week, and we'll have some analysis from our project managers and staff about how this is going to impact the schedule and the budget. And also what we want to know, obviously, is how this impacts the kids and their education. And so we're asking to postpone this vote. I think it's premature at this point, given this new information and things that are going on. It's premature at this point to vote it tonight. We would vote it rather closer to town meeting. The 16th is our next, would be our next regular meeting, since next week we only have that budget focus. And by then we should have at least some better recommendation, and the building commission the building committee, as well as the building commission, should have weighed in on this question. So I would ask your indulgence in postponing this until June 16th.
Okay, unless there's any objection, we will postpone it. And hopefully we'll have some good news.
Hopefully.
So a vote on the 16th, does that mean it would go in the supplemental mailing?
Yes, hopefully. I have to check with Melissa. I think the 16th is the deadline, but maybe we would have something written both ways. And I don't know. I don't exactly know how we'll do that magic trick, but we'll figure it out.
I'm not sure that there's a solution here, but it's a pretty complex issue, and
very
it
complex.
behooves us to give town meeting as much information as far in advance as possible.
Right.
Okay, let's move on to update on COVID-19 testing. Remember last week we I think voted, or at least gave a sense of the board that we should begin enforcing overnight parking ban, among other things, on June 1st, beginning June 1st. There's been a lot of communications to me, and I assume other select board members regarding this. And I just want to get a sense of whether the select board is interested in considering delaying this until the beginning of the fiscal year, July 1st. The main complaints I've received have to do with those residents who have tandem parking and have to, in the morning when they take the car out, if they are not in back, have to go into their neighbor's car and move it before they can move their car. And their concern is that their neighbor's car may have COVID virus. I don't know how significant a risk that is, but that is, their concerns. I don't know if there are any other concerns on that side of the issue. I know on the other side of the issue, a number of people in the areas near Boston are concerned because many Bostonians come into Brookline to use our parking spaces because of the parking problems they have in Boston. But I just wanted to ask the select board if there's any interest in revisiting that vote or just continuing and have the enforcement of the overnight parking ban begin June 1st. which was yesterday.
I'll just point out that we didn't actually have a vote. We gave a sense of the board, and I mean, frankly, I was surprised to hear that the changes were made starting so soon after our vote. I thought there was gonna be a little bit more time for the board to get out with those 10 things, but I'm willing to talk about it, and I'm wondering if there's any, and we're just, I think, talking about the overnight piece,
Yeah.
meters or anything like that. I just wonder if there's any, I don't know, cost to the town or what impact that would have on our side if we were to give people that kind of extension to July 1. I don't know if there's any way to even, maybe Mel.
Well, I would just say that I don't think it's, what we're really concerned about is fiscal 21. So, as you know, July 1st is that cutoff. So, at fiscal 20, of course, any amount of revenue that would be
Go to free
derived
cash.
from parking tickets is money. So, to the extent you don't have it, you lose it. But I'm not as concerned about fiscal 20 as I am about fiscal 21, which starts on July 1st.
So I'm sympathetic to the people who, have to tandem park and they have this issue and they're concerned about it. And I can certainly understand that. But how many people is it? And how many people, do we have any idea of how many people in the town have this kind of tandem parking arrangement? I would imagine it's a fairly small fraction, and that there are other ways to deal with that. I think it's important that the people who are on the borders, for instance, have more relief because they're being besieged. I think it's fair to be enforcing the overnight ban so that they aren't so disadvantaged. The people who tandem park, I mean, there must be some way we can work on permits for people, or and I know one email said, well, her neighbor wasn't, wearing a mask and using gloves, and so she could be contaminating the car. Well, that's true, but I mean, maybe there's a way they can work it out so that instead of having that person come, have that person move their car, the person has to move the car themselves, or something of that nature. I mean, I don't know, but and permits, and there have to be other things that, because everybody should be wearing masks and gloves. I mean, we've said that over and over and over again. So, and I think it's common courtesy, but there must be some way that there are not that many people. It can't be an overwhelming number who could have some sort of relief. And I don't know how that would look, what that would look like. I would rather speak with
transportation department.
Yeah, exactly, and get a sense of that.
And maybe, I guess what I'd like to know is, can we, in those situations where this is a serious concern, do we have a mechanism for providing temporary permits?
I guess my question is, it's unclear to me whether delaying enforcement from June 1 to July 1 solves any of the problems that have been identified. And I'm totally open to hearing it. I just can't come up with that answer now. And if there a month delay doesn't solve any of the problems that have been articulated, then it seems like we're talking about just delaying the inevitable. We're just pushing back this decision without any hope that a remedy is going to be arrived at.
Bernard, I think Chief Sullivan is maybe trying to weigh in here.
Okay, Chief Sullivan.
No, ma'am, just on for the call for the COVID part.
I think he knows better than to weigh in about parking issues in Brookline.
Yeah, I was wondering what you would have to say.
Don't park in front of the fire hydrant.
Okay, that's.
Yeah, I would also be in favor of if there is some way that there's a way to handle this through a special permit, like you said. I think it would be the better way to deal with this.
Yeah. So, is there an opportunity to use the permitting process to address this problem for those few people or many people who have this type of a problem? Mel, do you know?
I do not know, but I've asked if there are any staff available to answer that question.
If not, I would like to urge, I guess, you to explore with Todd Corain, some solution that avoids us putting off the enforcement to July 1st. I mean, if we can have a permitting system that helps those people who really have a serious problem, and of course would you make sure that we don't give such relief to people who just inconvenience. And I think that's the way to go. What do other people think?
Well, it looks like Todd's joined us, so he might be able to.
Okay. Todd, tell us how we can solve this.
Todd might not actually be ready to solve it. I just promoted him without asking.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, I'm on my phone. I'm also doing the town meeting test right now that just ended, so that's why I had to switch to my phone. Doing this on my phone is interesting because I can't see myself. Essentially, there is not a temporary permit that is currently available that could solve this issue. The creation of any temporary permit to do that would require the Transportation Board to actually enact the permit. Staff does not have the authority to do it on our own. I can bring this to the I can bring it up to the Transportation Board at their meeting on Monday, their meeting on Monday, June 8th, to see if they're interested in creating a special permit, a special temporary permit. I'm not sure of the criteria that we would have to create that would zero in on those that have a true hardship, while also blocking those people that are just simply wanting to park on the street because it's easier.
Yeah.
We got a lot of those emails as well. So it's going to take some time for us to think through the different policies to put in place, but I'm more than willing to bring it to the T-Board on Monday if the select board desires.
Isn't there currently a permit allowed for emergency and medical situations?
No, there's a temporary permit allowed for in-home healthcare aides, a daytime and an overnight. There's one for in-home child care, which is daytime. There is one for residents displaced due to construction reasons, tradesmen, as well as guest overnight, which has a $10 per night fee. There's not a general one for medical issues or medical conditions.
Right. Okay.
That being said, though, I forget who issues the handicap permits. They could apply for one of those.
So they're not handicapped.
Well, what are the parameters, Todd?
So the state issues the disability placards and plates, and you have to actually have a recognized disability, and you need a doctor's. There's several pieces of paperwork that doctors have to fill out, stating that you do have that recognized disability.
Okay. Well, let us know what happens when you take it up before the Transportation Board. There may not be a solution, but I think we have an obligation to at least look to see what can be done, if anything.
Okay, I definitely will.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kleckner, what other COVID issues do you want to bring to our attention?
I thought we wanted to talk about testing a bit, and so we're prepared to do that. But I would also just announce let you know that the governor did issue a new executive order yesterday. Everyone is busily evaluating that, and I participated in a webinar today. So releasing details about phase 2, which will be multiple phases within phase 2 and then phase 3 and 4. And so a lot of issues going on. I really haven't had the time and ability to really sort it out, but I did send you a copy of that order today, and I'll send you other materials, and the task force needs to get a handle on them as well. But obviously more of the same of making sure that businesses that are opened are doing so in a safe manner in accordance with all of the protocols established for social distancing and mitigation of the COVID spread. So don't have anything specifically to report on that. I also just wanted to remind everyone that Town Hall has not reopened to the public yet, but this week is what we refer to as a soft reopening to our employees. And so many of our employees are returning to work, although we are not probably going to get beyond 25% capacity on any one day, or roughly for a few more weeks. And then want to figure out when we can accommodate the public in Town Hall. We're currently continuing to do things by appointment and online means. And of course, we have to open up the Town Hall on next Tuesday for voting. But things are going well. All employees who come to Town Hall will see a different kind of Town Hall. There's been physical space differences. We have plexiglass in certain places, a lot of hand sanitizing stations. Rooms have been repurposed or closed. Employees who come to work have to take their temperature and do a self-assessment before they can come into the building, wear masks in common areas and so on. So soft opening this week, more official opening next week, and then public opening at some time in the future. So with that, I don't have anything more to add. Happy to answer any questions, but I believe that Chief Sullivan, who's our emergency management director and/or our public health director, can talk about testing a bit.
I did have one question on the reopening. There's been some chatter about social distancing at restaurants and outdoor dining, and I'm wondering if the task force has taken that up. It would seem that it's a licensing matter at some level and would require select board action. Is that?
Yes, I believe, well, it depends if the restaurant has a liquor license. Well, I guess any license, but a liquor license, I believe we are receiving some guidance from the ABCC. So I don't have all the information yet, but the answer is yes. We have many restaurants that are open who dine outside, and we have outdoor dining for probably dozens of restaurants. And so we expect those to be the first ones back, and we'll have to figure out how to deal with that. But also, we expect a lot more restaurants to ask if they can open up. And if they haven't opened up yet outside, it's probably because they don't have enough space on the sidewalk. And so we're going to have to then reckon with these other proposals about where, perhaps the sidewalk could be extended into the traveled way. And then not unlike what we've done with expanding some of the access to pedestrian areas. So outdoor dining, it seems to be our next challenge.
That was actually the question I wanted to pick up on was at what point we'll be talking more about the open streets format. I know when we initially voted it, this board, including myself, were very much against options 2 and 3, I think they were called, and we voted in favor of option 1. I'd be willing to explore options 2 and 3 now that folks are the whatever the governor was calling it has been lifted, and there's a safer at home advisory now. But with businesses open and more people being in the streets, the more obviously space we can provide in parks and everywhere else, the better. So I don't know if that can end up back on our docket sometime soon to talk about. That'd be great.
Okay. Let me add one thing. It's generally related to this. We've been having a lot of demonstrations, and we will continue to have demonstrations. I think it'd be useful for the health department to put out some type of notice or warning regarding demonstrations, and need to be careful and use your mask and try to exercise social distancing and take other precautions during demonstrations, which are really, really dangerous congregate gatherings. Some of the pictures I saw from gatherings or demonstrations across the country are scary in terms of how loose people were with their masks and how close people were in situations where there were very heated conversations being had, and I mean, it's just a little scary. I think we need to remind people that you know, when they attend demonstrations like this, it's not a time to let down the guard against the COVID virus.
Yeah.
Oh, Dr. Jack.
Yes, I would give you a brief comment on that. And you know, as you know, and everybody knows on the board, this is, you know, a difficult time. As you know, an African American man myself that have dealt with, you know, police harassment and a type of policing that happens in African American communities. What happens usually, you know, during a natural disaster or epidemic, it brings out the uglies of the systematic racism that has occurred in African American communities over hundreds of years. So you look at our social determinants of health and how it impacts poverty, healthcare, education, and as well as policing and the environments and the constructs of which people live. And the state has chimed in on this and understand that, you know, people are very angry at this time. And there has been reminders put out in different communities where people try to enforce, ask people nicely to wear a mask, practice social distancing, and they have put themselves in danger in doing that. So I think at this time, you know, the health department and health departments around the state of Massachusetts, we choose to take a step back right now because there's a heightened tension, and you don't want to. Not only we're very careful about the messaging, and myself and the ACPH was going to put out a statement to hopefully later this week in the tab, just to talk about the things that we have done, and we often talk about health equity. And I don't think this is a time we need to focus on COVID. We can expect the cases to arise, but right now people are less likely to worry about COVID when they die from some of the other things. And, you know, unemployment is 15%, but if you look in the African American community, it's always 6 or 7% higher than that. And so you're not only looking at healthcare, poor housing, education, poverty, and the system overall. And, you know, this is a time we need to think about a different way and how to approach some of these things, especially when you know that proportionally African American people are dying from a disease that could have been prevented. But when you're at the high spectrum anyway of health outcomes, you know, we just have to have different approaches. And so, you know, I'm very sympathetic. I understand the need to practice social distancing, need to wear a face mask, but at the same time, people are hurt, they're intense, and they want to be heard. And my message would not be one that would, you know, help them to achieve what they want to achieve.
My only, all I'm suggesting is that we remind people that in a demonstration, the COVID virus is still around. And, you know, there's certain, you know, small things you can do to at least reduce the risk that you face in a crowded situation. I mean, wearing masks and eye coverings is easy thing to do, and you can speak through the mask or even, you know, temporarily take it off if you have to, but, you know, still remember that you know, you need to protect yourself in this time, no matter where you are. That includes demonstrations. So that's all I was saying.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. The other problem is people are being locked up.
Those are separate issues. I mean, and you know, they have to be dealt with. But, you know, my only concern is that we just remind people that, you know, going to a demonstration does not mean you let down your guard any more than it means that you let down your guard and noticing who's around you and what may be happening with the police. You know, who's being agitated or whether they're agitated. It's just a question of being safe no matter where you are and what you're doing. So anyway,
I totally agree. And I will say I have witnessed today from the protest today from people in Brookline. They were wearing masks.
Any other COVID related stuff? Did Chief Sullivan speak?
Well, this initially started with an update on testing, so I don't know if there is an update.
Okay.
But I think we've concluded our antibody testing, and maybe we can just give a little update on future plans for testing. Dr. Jett or Dr. Chief Sullivan.
So I have applied for testing through the state. I'm still waiting for more follow-up.
And that's antibody testing?
No, that's just regular COVID testing.
Okay.
And so I put a request in for 5,000 swabs. I have been working with Fallon and Chief Sullivan on how we can administer that. But I think what is happening at the state, everybody's focused on reopening, which, I'm working on camps and reopening of camps. So we can do that. Hopefully put out a statement this week. So hopefully, I'm hoping in the next week or so, I will have more information.
Okay, anything else on COVID?
If you will, Mr. Chair, the EOC is just transitioning to supporting Dr. Jett and his team with messaging and doing a lot of work with the town clerk's office in the voting. So that's where our focus is right now for the reopening. And as soon as Dr. Jett gets the word from the state that we have any opportunity to do testing, we'll switch our focus there. We've got some preliminary plans in place for where we think we might be able to set up some testing spots for our folks, but that's on hold for right this moment until we get information back from the state.
Okay.
Are you able to, have you analyzed the results of the antibody testing, and are you able to give us any information about that?
So yes, I provided it about 2 weeks ago. I don't have any more updated information. I don't have the slides with me today, but the results was we initially posted. I can't put it in the slide for you again in one of the updated briefings.
Okay. Anything else from the select board? Any questions?
This is Mel again. I just might add that we've been notified that any municipal employees in Massachusetts can take advantage of I believe it's a free COVID test down in Foxborough at Gillette Stadium. I know it's a little far for some employees, but I think many of us are going to take advantage of it. And as I understand, any testing will then, flow up to state. And so wherever you're from, those statistics will follow you.
And the testing, question for Dr. Jett. I mean, if you have no symptoms, I mean, it's only to what would be the I guess the reason would be you could be symptomless, but still have the disease.
Yeah, so the testing at Gillette is to test anybody asymptomatic or symptomatic.
Yeah, okay.
So it'll just tell them if they're infected with COVID at that time. It's still a PCR. You drive up through your car. So that's how they're doing it. But you still have to make an appointment. If I'm correct, you have an appointment to do it.
Could you send the board, just an email as to how to or who to contact to make an appointment? Because we are municipal employees, board members.
Yes, we can.
Okay.
That's a good point. Hey, I wanted to ask about, I know, I feel like it was a few weeks ago, we had an HR director on and I asked some questions about, just wanted to better understand the impact of COVID on our workforce and not just the number of folks who were diagnosed positive, but also I know that folks were using FMLA and time off and things like that, and just to try to get a sense of what the impact has been. I was just hoping maybe, again, at a future meeting, we can get an update on that. That'd be helpful.
Yes.
Great,
Great.
thanks.
Okay. Okay, anything else? Anything under the category of other? No?
I just want to say I'm thankful to Dr. Jett and also to Pat Maloney and the rest of the staff. In addition to all of the work that they're doing related to COVID and testing, they're also managing the reopening and sort of making sure that the small business owners and the places that we love are safe, so that when they're open, we can be confident that the health department is doing inspections and things like that. And I know that that is taking a tremendous amount of time to do that, and will into the future. So just want to say thank you, Dr. Jett, Pat Maloney, and others.
Thank you. I will let staff know it is a serious undertaking, but you know, we'll get it done. Everybody has the expectation, along with graduations.
Oh, graduations! Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, seeing no further business, I will end the meeting. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.
There you go.